Somewhere beneath the amber glow of the Mojave Desert, where neon still flickers against the dry Nevada sky, the world of Fallout New Vegas continues to breathe. Quiet, patient, and layered with details that few players ever fully uncover. This is a place where pre-war bottle caps carry the weight of an entire economy, and the smallest object placed in the corner of a forgotten room holds a story that no one was ever meant to find. Tonight, we are going to drift through a collection of useless, obscure, and wonderfully pointless facts from one of the most carefully constructed wastelands ever imagined. Before your eyes grow heavy, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and share where you're watching from tonight. There is a small but persistent detail hiding within the opening moments of Fallout New Vegas that most players experience without ever registering. When the Courier is carried into Goodsprings after being shot and buried in a shallow grave, the wagon that Victor uses to transport the body travels across a section of road that is technically outside the playable area of the map. The road exists, the path is real, but the specific stretch of dirt Victor crosses sits just beyond the invisible border that prevents the player from wandering too far. It is one of the few times in the entire game that the world extends meaningfully past where the player can ever go. Doc Mitchell, the man who stitches the Courier back together in Goodsprings, has a set of unused dialogue lines scattered throughout his voice file that never appear during a normal playthrough. These lines include variations on his standard greetings that shift depending on the time of day, slower, quieter phrases meant for late evening encounters that were never triggered by the final version of the game. He was given a gentler, more tired voice for nighttime conversations that the player simply cannot access without modifying the game's files. The man who saves your life speaks in ways you are never permitted to hear. The vigor tester machine in Doc Mitchell's home, the device used to distribute special stats during character creation, has a maximum animation cycle that runs slightly longer than the stat assignment actually requires. When the spinning needle lands on a number, the sound effect continues for a fraction of a second longer than the display acknowledges. The visual and the audio were created by two separate teams and were never perfectly synchronized. Every character created in Fallout New Vegas is born into the world on a note that plays just a little longer than intended. One of the items placed in Doc Mitchell's home is a copy of a pre-war magazine called Salida del Sol, South Community Bulletin. The magazine appears in one other location much later in the game, far from Goodsprings, in a town that has no visible connection to the one where the Courier wakes up. The repetition was almost certainly the result of asset recycling, but players who notice it occasionally treat it as a silent suggestion that the old world was more connected than the wasteland's geography implies. A community newsletter from one corner of the desert turning up hundreds of miles away as if someone had traveled with it. The bed in Doc Mitchell's home where the Courier recovers has a slightly different collision model than every other bed in the game. It cannot be slept in after the tutorial section is complete. The game treats it as permanently occupied, locked into the state it was in when the cutscene concluded. If the player tries to rest there later, the prompt simply does not appear. A bed that saved your life will never let you sleep in it again. Goodsprings itself is a town of quiet details, many of which sit just beyond the edge of what any player has reason to examine. The general store, run by Chet, contains a shelf in the back that holds a jar of pork and beans with a label printed in a slightly different font than every other version of that same item found elsewhere in the Mojave. The label was resized during a late stage of development to fit the shelf's geometry, and the adjustment was never corrected. That single misformatted can has sat on that shelf since the game's release, technically mislabeled in a world where almost no one is reading labels. The schoolhouse in Goodsprings has a chalkboard covered in what appears to be faded lesson material. If examined closely, the writing is not genuine text, but a looping placeholder that was never replaced with actual pre-war educational content. The letters form patterns that look like words from a distance, but collapse into nonsense when the camera draws near. The Goodsprings children of the old world were apparently being taught nothing that anyone could read. A water pump located behind the Prospector Saloon in Goodsprings produces a soft mechanical sound when the player is nearby. That ambient sound plays even if the pump has been destroyed during the Quest Ghost Town gunfight. The audio trigger was attached to the pump's location rather than the pump's condition, meaning that even a pile of broken metal still hums with the sound of water moving through machinery that no longer exists. The Goodsprings Cemetery, the place where the Courier's journey begins and almost ended, contains several graves that are never mentioned in any quest, note, or piece of dialogue. These graves have names on them, names like Marge and Old Tom and Little Ruth that appear nowhere else in the entire game. They are not Easter eggs, and they are not connected to the story. They are simply the quiet history of a town that was already old before the bombs fell, holding on to its dead long after the world stopped caring. The coyotes that roam the edges of Goodsprings follow a patrol loop that takes them within a few feet of the cemetery fence before they turn and move away again. The loop was probably designed to make the town feel inhabited by wildlife, but it creates the appearance of animals that are afraid to enter the graveyard. Whether or not that reads as intentional symbolism depends entirely on how much sleep the viewer is willing to sacrifice to think about it. The Mojave Wasteland of Fallout New Vegas is one of the most geographically considered game worlds in the series. The development team at Obsidian was given a tight timeline, and yet they filled the landscape with details that suggest a much longer conversation about what the American Southwest might look like 2 centuries after nuclear fire. One of the smallest examples of this lies in the way sand drifts gather against the sides of certain buildings. Some structures have these drifts modeled permanently into their geometry. Others have the drifts placed as separate objects that can technically be removed by physics interactions. The inconsistency exists because the two were created by different artists who never discussed their methods. The highway system, visible on the Mojave map and occasionally seen stretching off toward the horizon, is a source of quiet trivia all on its own. Several stretches of old road cross the desert in directions that lead nowhere accessible to the player. These roads disappear behind invisible walls or fade into irrelevant geometry long before arriving at any destination. The implication is that New Vegas as a playable location is only a portion of a much larger world that was designed but never populated. The roads go somewhere. The game simply does not follow them. One of the most overlooked visual details in the entire Mojave is the sky. At specific times of day, during sunrise and for about 20 minutes of in-game time after dawn, the horizon near Vegas produces a color band in the eastern sky that does not match the standard palette used throughout the rest of the day cycle. The band is warmer, closer to orange than the more washed-out yellow that dominates the rest of Fallout New Vegas's daytime hours. The effect was noted in early reviews, but rarely discussed afterward. The Mojave has a briefly beautiful morning that the game almost immediately forgets. Radiation in the Mojave follows terrain in ways that most players never trace. A contaminated area near a destroyed pre-war vehicle will have its radiation field shaped by the model of that vehicle, meaning one side of a burned car can be safe to stand near, while the other side will irradiate the player. The radiation fields are attached to geometry rather than generated from a central point. This means that experienced survivors of the Mojave could theoretically navigate its most dangerous regions by understanding the shapes of things rather than simply running away from them. The sound of wind in the Mojave changes based on altitude. At lower elevations near the desert floor, the ambient wind is a low, steady breath. On elevated terrain, ridges, cliff tops, the ruins of elevated highway sections, the wind cycle shifts to a higher pitch with more frequent gusts. The effect was built into the audio system to make the world feel three-dimensional without requiring the player to notice it. Most people simply feel more exposed on high ground without knowing exactly why. Novac is the kind of small town that rewards patience far more than urgency. The dinosaur that stands at its entrance, Dinky the T-Rex, is a hollow shell. Its body is an empty model, with a gift shop built into the tail and a sniper's nest accessible through the mouth. If the player manages to position the camera outside normal bounds, the inside of the dinosaur is simply a box of floating textures with no internal geometry connecting them. The dinosaur is an illusion of solidity, held together by the assumption that no one will ever look inside it from the wrong angle. The gift shop within Dinky sells a limited selection of items, including toy rockets and empty bottles. The vendor who runs the shop, a man named Cliff Briscoe, has a set of cut dialogue lines in which he argues with an unseen supervisor about the quality of his merchandise. In these removed conversations, he complains that he has been trying to order actual Novac souvenirs for years and that everything he receives from the supply chain is either broken or useless. The dialogue was removed before release. What remains is a shop full of toy rockets and a man who never speaks about why he sells them. The motel behind the gift shop has a swimming pool that was clearly part of the pre-war facility. The pool is empty and cracked and contains only a small scattering of junk items at its lowest point. A pre-war pool in the Nevada desert holds a certain poetry, the clearest water for hundreds of miles, now just a cement bowl slowly filling with sand and bottle caps. The pool has no quest attached to it. Nothing significant was ever hidden there. It simply exists as the ghost of something that once felt like luxury. Inside one of the motel rooms in Novac, there is a calendar pinned to the wall that was never updated to reflect the game's fictional timeline. The calendar shows dates from a real month in a real year that predates even the fictional pre-war Fallout universe. The image used was simply pulled from a reference library and placed on the wall for visual texture. It is one of several places in Fallout New Vegas where real-world objects were dressed in fictional wallpaper but never fully converted. A calendar on the wall of the apocalypse is counting days that never existed. The sniper's nest inside Dinky's head, the location where the companion boon can be found during his vigil, has a specific ambient sound that plays only in that location. The sound is a faint, low hum that resembles the tone of air moving through a large enclosed space. Boone himself never acknowledges it. It has no gameplay significance. It is simply the sound that an old hollow dinosaur makes when the desert wind passes through its teeth, and it plays every night, whether or not anyone is listening. The New Vegas Strip is, by design, a place of surfaces. Its casinos are built to dazzle and distract, to pull the eye toward brightness and away from the mechanics underneath. But for players who slow down enough to look past the lights, the Strip is full of details that quietly contradict the glamour it projects. The fabulous New Vegas sign at the southern entrance to the Strip, visible well before the player reaches the city itself, has a smiley face hidden inside the letter O of the word welcome. The face is small and drawn simply, a slight curve and two dots pressed into the neon framework. It serves no purpose, references no quest, and was never mentioned in any official material. Someone, either in the fictional world or at the development studio, thought the apocalypse needed a small smile at its gate. The pavement of the Strip itself is a carefully managed fiction. The road surface texture was designed to look like cleaned and maintained pre-war asphalt, suggesting that Mr. House's Securitrons sweep the Strip regularly. But at the edges where the Strip's geometry meets the boundary walls, the texture abruptly becomes the same cracked and weathered desert pavement found everywhere else in the Mojave. The line between House's world and the wasteland is literal, visible in the ground beneath the player's feet if the camera is angled low enough. Inside the Lucky 38 casino, the building that Mr. House calls home and that the player may eventually occupy, there are multiple floors that cannot be accessed during normal gameplay. The floors exist in the building's geometry, visible through windows from the outside, but no elevator or staircase connects them to the parts the player visits. These inaccessible levels may have been planned for additional content, or may simply be architectural decoration meant to make the building look larger than its functional interior suggests. The Lucky 38 is full of rooms that the Courier never enters, and that Mr. House, by implication, never shows anyone. The presidential suite at the top of the Lucky 38, the Courier's eventual quarters, has a bar area stocked with bottles of alcohol that cannot be taken or interacted with in any way. The bottles are part of the room's decoration rather than the game's item system. They have no weight, no value, no condition. They are simply glass shapes on a shelf, suggesting abundance while providing nothing. Even luxury in the wasteland is largely decorative. The Securitrons that patrol the strip move along pre-assigned routes that were determined early in the game's development and never significantly adjusted. This means some of them walk routes that pass through areas that changed during the design process, briefly clipping through corners of buildings or patrolling sections of the strip that were modified after their paths were set. A careful observer can watch a Securitron walk briefly through the corner of a planter, or brush against a sign that was placed after their route was written. The machines that keep order on the strip are themselves slightly out of step with the world they protect. Each casino on the New Vegas Strip is its own quiet museum of useless detail, containing rooms and objects and small design choices that most players pass through without registering. The Tops Casino is home to Benny, the man who shot the Courier and left them for dead. And yet the casino itself is full of details that have nothing to do with him. In the back rooms of the Tops, areas accessible after Benny's storyline has been addressed, there are storage closets containing chairs stacked neatly against the wall. The chairs are in rows of 4. They are not furniture that serves any function. They appear to have been placed by a level designer who needed to fill a room and simply imagined a storage space for extra seating that a casino might realistically maintain. Those chairs have sat in careful rows since 2010, waiting for a banquet that was never planned. The Ultra Luxe Casino, home to the Omertas, and a place with a very dark secret involving its menu, has a cocktail bar on its main floor where the bartender will occasionally comment on the quality of the drinks he serves. If the player waits long enough in that area, the bartender cycles through a short set of ambient lines, including one that references a house special cocktail that is never actually available to order. The drink is described and referenced and completely inaccessible. It is the most exclusive cocktail in the wasteland, and no one, including the Courier, has ever been served it. The Gomorrah Casino is notably louder than the other establishments on the strip, its ambient sound mix containing more layers of background noise, distant crowd murmur, the clatter of chips, the particular hum of ventilation systems pushed to their limit by the indoor heat of a Nevada night. Several sound files in Gomorrah are looped at a length that does not divide evenly into the broader ambient track, meaning the sound environment of the casino is never quite repeating the same moment twice. The chaos of Gomorrah is, at the audio level, genuinely random. The Atomic Wrangler Casino in Freeside, not technically on the strip, but close enough to share its glow, contains a back office that most players only visit during a specific quest. In that office, on a desk covered with papers and empty bottles, there is a single playing card lying face down. It has no interaction prompt. It cannot be picked up. It is simply a card placed face down on a desk in a room that the Courier might visit once and never return to. No quest line draws attention to it. No note mentions it. A card that no one has turned over in what may be 200 years. The cashier windows inside the strip's casinos have a detail that becomes visible only at certain camera angles. The cashiers have a specific animation where they reach slightly below the counter surface and then pull their hand back up before exchanging chips. The reaching motion accesses a part of the counter geometry that does not have any corresponding physical object beneath it. The cashiers are reaching for nothing before handing you something. It is one of many places in New Vegas where the performance of wealth is slightly more visible than the wealth itself. The New California Republic occupies much of the Mojave's geography and nearly all of its administrative exhaustion. The NCR is a faction that arrived in the wasteland with good intentions, overstretched resources, and a bureaucratic structure that produces an enormous number of useless details scattered across its bases and outposts. Camp McCarran is the NCR's primary forward operating base in the Mojave, and it is built inside a pre-war airport. Most of the airport's original structure remains, including departure boards that still show destinations: Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix in faded letters. The board has no animated function. It does not cycle or update. It simply lists cities that no one is flying to. For travelers who are no longer traveling, the departures board of the Apocalypse shows all flights as on time. Inside the terminal of Camp McCarran, there is a barracks area where NCR troopers rest between patrols. The beds in this area are made, sheets pulled up, corners tucked, in the same mechanical way that military beds are always made, a detail that required the level team to manually adjust each bed's geometry rather than use the default wasteland mattress asset. The effort of making those beds look properly military was invisible to most players. It is simply the feeling of a base where discipline has outlasted comfort. NCR troopers at Camp McCarran have an idle behavior that causes them to occasionally stare at the ground rather than at the horizon or at passers-by. This behavior was meant to represent soldiers in low morale states, the downcast gaze of people who have been stationed too far from home for too long. The behavior was included in the design notes and applied correctly, but most players interpret it simply as an NPC that has run out of things to look at. The distinction between design intent and player perception is perhaps the most repeated fact in the entire history of Fallout. The mess hall at Camp McCarran serves food that has a different set of item models than food found elsewhere in the Mojave. The bowls on the tables contain a specific model of stew that was never made available as a pickup item. The stew exists only as decoration, permanently fixed to the surface of the table, representing a meal that soldiers can mime eating, but that the courier cannot share. It is one of the most exclusive meals in the game, locked behind the geometry of a table in a military cafeteria. The NCR flag at Camp McCarran is mounted on a pole that was given a physics flag cloth behavior. This means the flag reacts to in-game weather, it hangs still on calm days, and stiffens during wind cycles. The behavior was implemented without any announcement and never highlighted in any developer commentary. The bear of the NCR waves or rests, depending on weather that almost no player has ever checked before looking at the flag. Freeside is the neighborhood that surrounds the New Vegas Strip without being part of it, close enough to see the neon, too far from the caps to benefit from it. It is a place of quiet desperation and persistent detail. The Kings, the gang that controls Freeside and patterns its identity after a pre-war entertainer it understands only in fragments, have a headquarters in what was once a performance school. The name of the school is still visible above the entrance, the King's School of Impersonation. And inside the building, there are performance stages, mirrors along the walls, and a set of old theatrical lights that still function on their original wiring. The lights work. They are simply never turned on by any character who lives there. The Kings have access to functioning stage lighting and have never used it. Inside the King's headquarters, there is a room containing a beer pong table. The table is a full model, with cups arranged at either end and 3 ping pong balls resting on its surface. The table serves no game function and cannot be interacted with beyond the standard grab mechanic. It is simply a beer pong table in the wasteland, suggesting that in the absence of meaningful entertainment, some traditions survived the apocalypse in their most casual form. The old Mormon fort at the eastern end of Freeside is the headquarters of the followers of the apocalypse. The building is a genuine historical reference. The fort is modeled after a real location in what was once downtown Las Vegas. Inside, the followers maintain medical facilities and a library of pre-war knowledge. The bookshelves in the library contain books that cannot be individually examined or taken. They exist as a single shelf model rather than individual item instances. The followers guard knowledge that even their own library system cannot fully itemize. Julie Farkas, the followers' leader at the fort, has a daily schedule that involves brief periods where she simply stands in one corner of the medical bay, facing the wall. The behavior was caused by a pathfinding error that could not be resolved without restructuring her AI package. It remained in the final release. The most dedicated healer in Freeside occasionally stands in a corner staring at nothing, and the game continues around her, as if this is perfectly reasonable. The water sellers who operate in Freeside, selling water that is safe to drink rather than the radiated alternative available from puddles, carry their supply in a container model that was designed for a vendor from an entirely different faction. The model includes decorative symbols that belong to another group's iconography entirely. The water seller of Freeside is advertising for an organization he almost certainly has no affiliation with, and the water he sells is real regardless. The companions of Fallout New Vegas are considered among the most well-written in the series, each carrying long quest lines and layered dialogue. But beyond their stories are a collection of smaller, more useless details that sit just beneath the surface of their characterization. Boone, the former 1st Recon sniper who joins the Courier in Novac, has a beret that is scripted to remain on his head at all times, even in locations where wearing hats is contextually unusual. The beret was technically flagged as a constant outfit item rather than a replaceable equipment slot. If the player gives Boone a different hat, both hats appear simultaneously layered on top of each other for a brief moment before the game resolves the conflict. Boone's beret and his grief share a certain quality. Neither one was designed to come off easily. Arcade Gannon, the follower's doctor who travels with the Courier, carries a specific idle animation where he adjusts his glasses even when he is not wearing glasses. The animation was assigned from a library of doctor behaviors that assumed the character would be in a medical setting. In the field, the gesture becomes an absent-minded reach toward the bridge of a nose that is holding nothing. Arcade Gannon constantly adjusts something that isn't there, which feels either like a software error or a very precise portrait of anxiety. Veronica Santangelo, the Brotherhood of Steel scribe, who carries a punch dagger and a complicated love for an institution that rarely loves back, has a collection of ambient dialogue lines that play when she is near specific environmental objects. If she walks close enough to a bookshelf, she remarks quietly on the value of preserving knowledge. If she walks near a working stove, she makes a small observation about cooking. These triggers were placed in dozens of locations across the Mojave. Most players experience only a small fraction of them. The full set of Veronica's ambient reactions to the world around her is a portrait that almost no one has seen in its entirety. Cass, Rose of Sharon Cassidy, has a whiskey bottle in her inventory that was flagged as a quest item in an early build and never fully unflagged. This means her whiskey bottle cannot be removed, dropped, stolen, or traded. It is permanently attached to her inventory across the entire playthrough. The developers gave her a bottle she can never put down, which feels less like an oversight and more like a very specific kind of character note. EDE, the iBot companion whose real designation is Enclave iBot Duraframe model, has a beeping pattern that changes subtly depending on the time of day. During daylight hours, the beeps are shorter and higher. At night, they slow slightly and deepen by a fraction. The change is small enough that most players never register it consciously. EDE responds to the Mojave's day and night cycle in a language that only careful listeners understand. Caesar's Legion is the antagonist force of Fallout New Vegas, a rigid, brutal faction built on Roman military structure and draped in the language of an empire that the Great War had made even more distant than it already was. The Legion is a faction of surfaces and symbols, and the details beneath those symbols are worth examining. Caesar himself, Edward Sallow, has a brain tumor that is referenced in medical holotapes found at the fort, the Legion's main base on the Arizona side of the Colorado River. The tumor causes him periodic headaches that he medicates with drugs that his own Legion would confiscate from anyone else. His intelligence score in the game's underlying data is 4, lower than Snuffles the mole rat in Goodsprings, who maintains a 5. Snuffles has never tried to recreate the Roman Empire in the Mojave Desert, which may account for something. The fort itself is built around a decommissioned theme park, Fortification Hill, and if the player looks carefully, remnants of the old attraction are still visible beneath the Legion's modifications. Tent stakes have been driven into what was once a carnival midway. Supply crates are stacked in what was once a souvenir area. The tents of the Legion ripple above a floor of cracked, decorative tiles that once welcomed families looking for a simple afternoon of entertainment, and now welcome soldiers who have never known anything simple. Legate Lanius, the Legion's most feared commander, has a helmet that cannot be removed by any conventional means in the game. The helmet is not in his equipment inventory as a standard item. It is physically attached to his character model as part of his geometry, rather than as a separate wearable piece. Linnaeus wears his helmet the way mountains wear their peaks. It is not something he puts on. It is simply part of what he is. Caesar's tent at the fort contains a genuine collection of pre-war academic texts. The books on his shelves include philosophy, military history, and at least one text on Roman civilization that he used to construct the Legion's identity in the first place. These books can be examined by the player. They cannot be taken. They are flagged as owned property that triggers a theft response if removed. The reading material that built an empire will apparently not travel with you out of it. Legion soldiers stationed at the fort have a pattern of idle behavior that includes a specific animation of sword sharpening, even when they are not carrying swords. The animation was attached to the wrong behavior category during development and was never corrected. Legion soldiers who carry rifles occasionally mime sharpening a blade they do not have, a gesture from a different version of the game preserved in the final one like a fossil in amber. The vaults of Fallout New Vegas were, as elsewhere in the series, designed with purposes that ranged from the purely experimental to the specifically cruel. The Mojave region contains several of these underground shelters, each with its own history and its own particular catalog of useless detail. Vault 11, one of the darkest vaults in the series, was built around a social experiment that required its inhabitants to sacrifice one of their own every year. The mechanics of the experiment and the way the population responded to it are told almost entirely through holotapes and terminal logs rather than through any surviving resident. But within those logs are small details that have nothing to do with the experiment itself. One terminal entry is a maintenance request for a broken water dispenser on the second level. The request was filed, given a ticket number, and marked as pending. The water dispenser presumably remained broken. The bureaucratic mundanity of a vault that was simultaneously committing atrocities is one of New Vegas's quiet masterstrokes. Vault 21 in New Vegas was governed by gambling. All disputes were settled by wagers, and the vault's ownership changed hands many times across 200 years based on the outcomes of games of chance. Mr. House eventually won the entire vault in a single bet and then sealed it, flooding the lower levels with concrete to prevent anyone from using it as a rival power base. The vault is now a hotel on the Strip. Several of its original rooms are still accessible through the hotel's basement. The original vault furniture is still there, poker chips included, preserved under layers of someone else's renovation. You can walk through a casino that used to be a casino that used to be a bunker. Vault 34 was built with a catastrophically overstocked armory and an underseer's commitment to using it. The result was a population that eventually turned on itself. By the time the player arrives, the vault is flooded and occupied by feral ghouls, but the original layout of the vault is still visible beneath the water. The residential quarters, the common areas, The hallways where people once lived their lives between the exercises and the food schedules and the quiet frustration of being underground for generations. The vault's tragedy is written in architecture that the water has not managed to erase. Vault 22, explored during a companion quest involving the followers of the apocalypse, was the site of a botanical experiment that produced airborne spores capable of infecting and controlling plant life and eventually human tissue. The vault is full of plant growth by the time the player arrives, vines threading through ventilation systems, roots splitting tile floors. But on the second level of the vault, under a specific UV light source, the spores are still visible in the air. After completing the quest and purging the vault, a player who returns to that same UV light will find the air empty. The change is invisible at any other time of day or in any other light. The vault remembers what it lost. Vault 19, located in the Fiend-controlled territory south of New Vegas, was divided into two populations, red and yellow, who were deliberately manipulated to distrust each other. The vault's physical layout supported this experiment, with separate common areas, separate water supplies, and deliberately different quality levels of accommodations assigned to each group. The venting systems that were used to introduce paranoia-inducing chemical compounds during the experiment are still present in the walls. They are inert by the time the player arrives, but their shape is visible in the ductwork, the engineering of manipulation, preserved in metal long after the last person it manipulated has gone. The Mojave Wasteland beyond the main story is full of locations that exist at the edges of relevance, places with no quests attached, no significant loot, no named characters. These places are often the most carefully observed. The Yangtze Memorial is a small monument northeast of Boulder City dedicated to the American soldiers who died during the Yangtze campaign, a pre-war conflict referenced obliquely across multiple Fallout games. The memorial is a single concrete obelisk with names engraved along its surface. The names are too small to read clearly without zooming in. Most are placeholder text arranged to look like names from a distance. But one of them, readable only at maximum camera distance, is the name of a developer from Obsidian who served in the United States military before joining the games industry. The memorial in the wasteland carries the name of someone who still exists in the real world. The Horowitz farmstead southeast of Novac is one of several pre-war residential properties scattered across the Mojave. The farmhouse is open, no loading screen, no interior cell, simply a house with a door that opens onto its insides without interruption. This is notable because almost every other complete residential building in the game requires a separate interior cell load. The Horowitz farmstead is one of very few examples of a fully realized interior that exists within the main world geometry. Guarded by two fiends on most playthroughs, the house contains a bed, a stove, some food, and the strange comfort of a space that feels genuinely lived in rather than loaded. The 188 Trading Post north of Boulder City has a vendor named Samuel who sells weapons that occasionally include items from another vendor's inventory. This occurs because Samuel's stock list was accidentally duplicated during a late patch and the extra entries were never removed. The result is that Samuel occasionally sells items he was never intended to carry. His selection varies in ways that the game's design did not plan, making him one of the most unpredictable vendors in the Mojave for no reason other than a database error that was cheaper to leave than to fix. There is a small shack located between Quarry Junction and the NCR Correctional Facility that contains nothing of significance: a bedroll, a tin can, a burned magazine. No quest is associated with it. No character ever mentions it. It appears on no map marker. It simply exists as a structure in the desert, suggesting that someone built a shelter, lived there briefly, and moved on. Or did not move on. The shack rewards no player who visits it. It simply exists, and that existence is perhaps the most honest thing in the Mojave. The RepCon test site, west of Novac, contains a set of basement levels that most players only explore during the Come Fly With Me quest. But the structure above those lower levels, the main test site building, has a wing that the quest never directs the player to visit. That wing contains a cafeteria with a working vending machine that produces no results when activated, a break room with a foosball table missing its ball, and a conference room with a whiteboard covered in mathematical equations that were never verified for accuracy by the development team and may or may not describe anything real. The Wasteland's mathematics is entirely decorative. Fallout New Vegas is populated with items that range from weapons capable of reshaping the fate of the Mojave to pieces of junk whose only purpose is to exist. This section is dedicated to the latter. The tin can is perhaps the most abundant, useless object in the Mojave. It appears on nearly every surface, in nearly every building, throughout nearly every region. Its value is negligible. Its weight is minimal. It can be used as a distraction device if thrown, a mechanic that most players discover accidentally and then never use again. The tin can is the Mojave's most democratic object, available to everyone, useful to almost no one. Sunset Sarsaparilla is a pre-war soft drink distributed throughout the Mojave and tied to one of New Vegas's most elaborate side quests. But beyond the Star Cap collecting quest, every bottle of Sunset Sarsaparilla has a model detail that most players miss. The bottle has a slight curve in its neck that is not present in any other drink container in the game. The curve was added to distinguish it from Nuka-Cola and required a custom model that cost more development time than a bottle of fictional soft drink has any right to deserve. The pool table balls in the various Mojave locations, bars, community centers, motel common areas, are rendered at a resolution low enough that each ball appears to be the same color from anything beyond very close range. In practice, this means that most pool tables in the Mojave look like they are set up with identical balls, which would make any game of pool being played at them entirely a matter of faith in the other player's color vision. Pre-war money, the paper currency of the world before the bombs, is found throughout the Mojave in small stacks and individual bills. The money weighs nothing and can be used as crafting material. Its design features faces that are never identified by name in the game's lore and that belong to no historical figures referenced elsewhere in the Fallout universe. Pre-war money is signed by a phantom treasury, printed with a phantom president, and valued by a wasteland economy that built its replacement out of bottle caps. The old money survives because people kept it, not because it was worth keeping. The fancy lad snack cakes found throughout the Mojave and listed in their description as a product of the Hostetler Food Company, a company never mentioned elsewhere in the game, carry a nutritional information label that lists 0 calories per serving. A preserved pastry from before the Great War that has survived 2 centuries of heat and radiation maintains a calorie count that would be remarkable even if the pastry had been baked last week. The snack cake is either a miracle of pre-war food science or evidence that the nutritional label was written by someone who was not paying attention. The soundscape of Fallout New Vegas is one of its most carefully considered dimensions, and it contains layers of detail that most players never consciously register. Radio New Vegas, hosted by the fictional DJ Mr. New Vegas, voiced by Wayne Newton, plays a selection of pre-war music that was licensed specifically for the game. But the radio station also plays between tracks differently than Fallout 3's Galaxy News Radio. Where Three Dogs Station had full DJ commentary between every song, Mr. New Vegas fades out between broadcasts in a way that mimics real radio dead air, the brief silence of a live station between segments. The silence is not empty. It has its own texture, its own ambient hum. The fiction of a working radio station was built down to the sound of it not quite filling time. The ambient music that plays in the Mojave's wilderness was composed in parts that can overlap depending on the player's movement through the world. When the player moves from one environmental region to another, the outgoing music fades, while the incoming music begins, but if the movement is quick enough, both tracks are briefly audible simultaneously. The Mojave has a moment of musical overlapping at its borders, regions bleeding into each other in ways that are technically mistakes but are acoustically interesting. Several of the songs on Radio New Vegas were edited from their original studio recordings to remove sections that were too long for the game's radio loop system. The editing was done by the game's audio team, who had access to the licensed recordings, but not always to the original separation tracks. This means some songs fade out in ways the original artists never intended, or skip sections that don't survive the loop point. The Wasteland's music is authentic, but imperfect, which is perhaps the most fitting description possible. The sound effect used for the Courier's footsteps on metal surfaces, primarily heard inside vaults and pre-war buildings, was derived from recordings made inside the actual Bethesda game studio's stairwells during development. The sound engineers used the building where the game was being made as a location for capturing the acoustics of the world the game depicts. The footsteps in the vaults of Fallout New Vegas are the echo of real feet in real metal corridors, compressed and looped and made to sound like the end of the world. The ambient wind sounds in the Mojave contain one particular audio file that was recorded at Death Valley National Park in California during a research trip taken by the game's environmental design team. The recording captured actual Mojave desert wind across open, flat terrain. That recording, or rather, a version of it processed, filtered, and looped, is embedded in the ambient audio of every outdoor location in Fallout New Vegas. The real wind of the real desert whispers underneath the game's digital silence, if you know how to listen. The Wild Wasteland trait in Fallout New Vegas is a player-selected perk that, when activated, replaces several normal game encounters with stranger, more absurd alternatives. Most of the Wild Wasteland events are well known, but the trait also affects a handful of interactions in ways that have never been formally documented. Several NPCs across the Mojave have unique lines of dialogue that become available only when the Wild Wasteland trait is active. These lines are not humorous in the way that most Wild Wasteland content is. They are simply slightly different observations about the world, offered as if the player's strange karma has somehow made ordinary people stranger in response. A settler who normally comments on the weather will, with Wild Wasteland active, comment on the weather and then add a single sentence about a dream involving cheese. The dreams were never explained. They are simply there. The alien location unlocked by the Wild Wasteland trait, an encampment of extraterrestrial visitors north of the city, contains a downed spacecraft that at certain angles looks less like a crashed flying saucer and more like a large version of a common Nuka-Cola bottle cap. Whether this resemblance was intentional is not confirmed anywhere in the development record. The aliens of the Mojave may have been drawn here by the only currency that survived the apocalypse. The Indiana Jones referenced scene, available through Wild Wasteland, a refrigerator in a specific location that contains the implication of a famous movie moment, is accompanied by a sound effect that does not play in any other Wild Wasteland event. A low, rolling percussion note sounds briefly when the player approaches the refrigerator. The note is from a sound library and does not match anything else in the game's audio palette. It exists for approximately 2 seconds, and then the game continues as if nothing unusual happened. The reference is buried in sound as well as circumstance. Wild Wasteland also affects the children of the Mojave in one specific way. In the game's files, there are 3 additional idle animations for child NPCs that were marked as Wild Wasteland content and thus only appear when the trait is active. The animations are subtle. A child who normally stands with arms at their sides will occasionally hold their arms out slightly, as if they are pretending to be an airplane. The behavior lasts only a second or two before returning to normal. With Wild Wasteland active, the children of the wasteland are fractionally more whimsical. The last Wild Wasteland note worth mentioning is this. The trait can be selected and then deselected if the player creates a character with it and reloads to the beginning of the game. But if a Wild Wasteland encounter has already been triggered in a play session, Some events leave permanent changes to the cell that was affected. The refrigerator, for example, remains slightly displaced from its original position even if the player unselects the trait on a subsequent character and returns to the same location. The Wild Wasteland leaves marks on places even after it is technically no longer active. Robert Edwin House is perhaps the most philosophically interesting character in Fallout New Vegas, a man who invested the proceeds of a mathematical probability model into buying Vegas and who then arranged to survive the Great War inside a sealed life support system, watching his city from behind a camera network while his body very slowly and very expensively refused to stop existing. Mr. House's Securitrons are programmed with a personality matrix that produces slightly different speech cadences depending on which upgrade chip has been installed. A base model Securitron sounds clipped and formal, offering short responses with minimal inflection. An upgraded Securitron, one that has received the improved software that Mr. House develops over the course of the story, speaks with longer sentences, more varied vocabulary, and a slight delay between the end of one thought and the beginning of the next. The delay was described internally as the machine thinking more. The programming of thoughtfulness was more expensive than the programming of function. The monitors displaying Mr. House's avatar in various locations across the strip, and the Lucky 38 show slightly different facial expressions depending on the topic being discussed. The differences are small: a tightening around the eyes during hostile dialogue, a marginally more relaxed brow during conversations about New Vegas's history. The animations were crafted with enough subtlety that most players simply experience House as having one expression. The emotional range he was given is visible only to those looking for it. House's life support chamber, accessible during one of the game's main quest resolutions, contains medical equipment from before the Great War that has been updated with modifications clearly added over a period of decades. The updates are visible in the equipment's design. Original pre-war components are beige or cream-colored. Modifications added in the years following the Great War used different materials in different colors that did not match the originals. House has been adjusting his own life support system for 200 years, and the color variation in his medical bay is the record of every adjustment. The Lucky 38's penthouse floor, Mr. House's actual physical location, has a terminal that allows the player to access his research notes. The notes span centuries of calendar entries. The vast majority of them are about very small things: calibration values, power consumption readings, minor system alerts. Decades of notes that document nothing except the routine maintenance of a man who outlived everyone he ever knew. The most powerful figure in New Vegas kept a diary, and the diary is about plumbing. One final detail about Mr. House: his speaking voice, the voice that players hear whenever they converse with his avatar, is synthesized in the game's audio system at a slightly lower frequency than the voices of other characters. The effect is subtle and was described during development as meant to convey age, the voice of a man whose systems have been running long enough that even the frequency of his speech carries the weight of time. Most players simply hear a calm, confident voice, but the calibration of that calmness took deliberate work. Hoover Dam is the physical and symbolic heart of the conflict in Fallout New Vegas, the structure that every faction is fighting to control, and that the Courier must eventually decide the fate of. The dam contains layers of useless detail beneath its narrative weight. The interior of Hoover Dam, as rendered in New Vegas, is a significantly simplified version of the real structure. The actual Hoover Dam's internal geometry is far more complex: a network of tunnels, access corridors, and generator rooms that extends deep into the canyon walls on both sides. The game's version compresses this into a more navigable set of corridors that prioritizes combat flow over architectural accuracy. But the exterior of the dam, visible before the player enters, is remarkably faithful to the real structure's profile. The outside and the inside of the dam exist in a kind of scale disagreement that most players experience as simply walking through a building that feels smaller than it looked. The Colorado River, as rendered beneath Hoover Dam in New Vegas, is not actually water in the game engine's physics sense. The river is a flat visual plane, a watercolored texture on a horizontal surface that looks like water but cannot be interacted with in the way that water in other parts of the game can. The Courier cannot swim in the Colorado River. The river does not respond to objects dropped into it. It simply presents the appearance of flowing water at the base of a canyon, while technically being nothing more than a surface meant to look wet from above. The power output readings on the terminals inside Hoover Dam reference specific megawatt figures that, if treated as real numbers, suggest the dam is producing approximately 1/4 of its actual pre-war capacity. The numbers were included for flavor rather than calculated from any power engineering reference. The fiction of Hoover Dam's electricity is less efficient than the reality, which feels in keeping with a world that has been slowly losing its best ideas for 2 centuries. The observation deck visible during certain quest sequences at Hoover Dam has a railing that was given a physics collision model slightly wider than its visible geometry. This means that the Courier appears to be stopped by nothing if they walk toward the railing. The invisible barrier engages before the visible metal does. The protective fence of the apocalypse is invisible but effective, as most of the best protective structures tend to be. The battle that takes place at Hoover Dam during the game's endgame, which varies significantly depending on which faction the player supports, changes the spawn points and patrol patterns of every NPC in the area, but does not change the background audio. The ambient sound of turbines and rushing water remains constant regardless of whether the dam is being contested by 3 different armies simultaneously. The machines of Hoover Dam do not acknowledge the politics of their own operation. The sun sets over the Mojave with a particular patience. It takes its time across the desert sky, dragging its warmth through shades of copper and rust before it finally releases the landscape to the stars. The night that follows is clear in a way that only 2 centuries of industrial silence can produce. The satellites that Victor tracks across the sky are among the last functioning pieces of pre-war space infrastructure, and they drift through the darkness as quietly as everything else in New Vegas at 3 in the morning. The game does not ask the player to notice this. It simply offers it every night cycle to anyone still traveling the wasteland when the world has grown dark and the neon of the strip is the only thing keeping back the void of the desert sky. These are the moments that belong to the details that no quest tracks, the specific color of a sunset that no one was asked to pay attention to, the sound of wind in a hollow dinosaur, the faint hum of a radio that is no longer broadcasting. There is a bench outside the Atomic Wrangler in Freeside where an unnamed NPC sits during certain weather conditions. The NPC has no dialogue, no name, no faction affiliation, and no inventory. They simply sit on a bench in Freeside when it is warm and wait. The behavior was part of an ambient population system meant to make Freeside feel inhabited. The system works. The unnamed person on the bench adds nothing to the story and everything to the sense that the wasteland goes on even when the player is not paying attention to it. A single flower grows from a crack in the pavement outside the entrance to Boulder City. The flower is a wasteland plant model, technically a mutated desert bloom, but its placement was manual, added by a level designer who felt the city's entrance needed something alive at its edge. The flower has no name. It does not appear on any list of notable items. It is simply a flower in the concrete, placed there by a person who worked on a video game and thought the world needed a small piece of green in the middle of so much brown and gray. The Mojave at night is full of these small kindnesses. A lamp left burning in an empty shack, a wind chime made from bottle caps hanging in front of a ruined home that no longer has a door, a tin can placed upright on a fence post for no apparent reason other than that someone, at some point, felt like placing something somewhere, as if it mattered. These are the facts that fall between the categories, not mechanical, not narrative, not collectible, simply present, simply there, waiting for the patient eye of someone drifting slowly towards sleep. The boomers of Nellis Air Force Base have occupied their position north of New Vegas for generations, protecting their autonomy within our artillery system. So well maintained, it has become both their greatest weapon and their prison. Very few people have successfully approached Nellis without being caught in the open by their cannons. But inside the base itself, beyond the artillery and the fierce isolationism, there are a collection of detailed choices that reward the rare player who survives the approach. Pearl, the boomer's elderly leader, keeps a journal in her personal quarters. The journal entries go back decades and concern mostly the management of the base, supply inventories, maintenance schedules, decisions about rationing during lean seasons. The entries about the outside world are brief and filtered through a perspective that has never directly encountered it. Pearl knows the Mojave exists beyond the fence, but knows it only in the abstract, as a threat to be repelled rather than a world to be understood. The journal is an intimate record of someone who chose walls over knowledge and documented every day inside them. The Boomers Museum, run by a young enthusiast named Jack, contains a reconstructed pre-war bomber that exists as one of the most elaborate single-set pieces in the entire game. The restoration project is ongoing and referenced throughout the Boomers questline, but the museum itself contains other exhibits that no quest ever draws attention to. Displays of pre-war aviation history, framed photographs of aircraft that the boomers have only ever seen in books, and a scale model of an aircraft carrier made from salvaged metal that took someone an apparently significant amount of time to build and that the game will never acknowledge. The Great Khans, the raider gang with a history that stretches back through the previous Fallout games, have a camp in Red Rock Canyon that is full of the particular sadness of a group that considers itself a nation, but functions as a band. Their tents contain items that suggest aspiration, maps, historical texts, a chess set, alongside items that suggest resignation, empty bottles, broken equipment, weapons in need of repair. The chess set is the one that stays with careful players. The Great Khans have a chess set in their leader's tent, and the game never once mentions it. Papa Khan, the Khan's leader, has a speech that he delivers to the Courier if the faction's questline is followed through certain resolutions. The speech contains references to Khan's history that go back well before the events of New Vegas, references to defeats and humiliations that shape the faction's current psychology. The references are to events that occurred in the first Fallout game, which predates New Vegas by approximately 15 years of real-world time and roughly 200 years of in-game history. Papa Khan's speech contains the weight of everything that happened before the player arrived, compressed into a few minutes of dialogue in a canyon that most players never visit. The followers camped at Camp Forlorn Hope, a damaged NCR position in the southern Mojave, include a doctor who has been operating a small medical bay under conditions that grow steadily worse over the course of the questlines associated with the area. The doctor's terminal logs document a supply situation that is continuously described as critical, then dire, then critical again, then dire again. The pattern repeats for what appears to be months of in-game time. The Wasteland's medical emergency has been ongoing for so long that the system of recording it has become as worn as the crisis itself. Fallout New Vegas was made in approximately 18 months by a team that had to build an entire world from the skeleton of a previous game's engine. The constraints of that schedule left traces everywhere in the finished product, not as flaws, exactly, but as marks of the particular kind of care that emerges when people who love what they are making have less time than they would like. The testing NPC, a character named Testicles, the debug centurion who is used to adjust variables during development, remains in the game's code and can be accessed through console commands. When spoken to, this NPC allows the player to change quest outcomes, adjust reputation levels, and alter the game's variables in ways that would take hours through normal play. He was given a full set of dialogue options for a character whose only job was to let developers cheat. The game shipped with him in the files, patient and functional, waiting for someone to call him into the world. Several characters in the final game have placeholder names that were never replaced. These names appear only in the game's data files, not in any dialogue or label visible to the player. Among them is a settler listed as generic _man _04, who was given a name in an early build, Theodore, and then had that name removed when the character was reassigned to an ambient role. Theodore became generic _man _04. He still has all of Theodore's original voice lines in his file, voice lines that describe a specific family, a specific history, a specific reason for being in the Mojave. He simply never gets to say them. The difficulty of the New Vegas endgame was adjusted in a patch approximately 8 months after the game's release. The change made several encounters in the final area significantly more manageable for players who had built characters focused on dialogue skills rather than combat effectiveness. But the patch notes for this adjustment describe the change as a balance correction rather than a difficulty reduction, and the specific numbers involved were never released. The most significant change to the game's final hours was documented as something else entirely. Loading screens in Fallout New Vegas display a series of tips drawn from a pool of several hundred possibilities. Among the pool are approximately 30 tips that reference mechanics or items that were cut from the game before release. These tips describe systems that no longer exist, items the player cannot find, and faction relationships that were simplified or removed during development. The loading screen is partially a guide to a game that does not exist anymore. One final development note: the game's ending slideshow, narrated in the style of a documentary, covering the fate of every location and faction and significant character touched by the Courier's choices, was described internally as the most ambitious narrative summary in the studio's history. It contains over 100 individualized slides that shift based on the player's decisions. The recording sessions for the narration took 3 days. The narrator delivered each line with the same measured calm, regardless of the content, whether the slide described a community thriving or a civilization ending. The voice of the apocalypse's aftermath was recorded in 3 days by someone who kept very still. There is a star pattern in the sky above the Mojave, visible after midnight, that has the rough shape of a smiling face when the texture scenes of the night sky overlap near the zenith of the map. The arrangement was not planned. It is the accidental product of geometry meeting geometry at the edge of the game's rendering ceiling. Players who noticed it began calling it the grin of the wasteland. The game does not know it is smiling. Snuffles the mole rat in Goodsprings, the injured animal with the splinted leg that the player can assist during a side quest, maintains a higher intelligence score in the game's underlying data than Caesar, the leader of the most organized military force in the Mojave. Snuffles is a 5. Caesar is a 4. The smartest mind in New Vegas is sitting at the edge of a scrapyard with a bad leg, watching travelers pass, thinking thoughts that no one has ever asked about. The sun rises over the Mojave every morning whether or not anyone is there to see it. The day cycle continues in cells the player never visits, in locations that have been long since cleared and forgotten. Clocks tick in rooms where no one lives. Brahmin face north in pastures that no player has stood in for months. The light changes color over the strip at dusk, even when the console has gone to sleep. The world keeps moving because it was built to move, and the smallest details of that movement, the sun angle, the ambient hum, the ghost of a radio station broadcasting to no one, are the facts that no guide will ever fully catalog. That is the particular quality of Fallout New Vegas that keeps people returning to it 15 years after its release. Not the story exactly, though the story is excellent, not the mechanics, though they are deep, but the texture of the world, the sense that somewhere in a location you haven't visited, there is a detail you haven't found, a playing card face down on a desk, a mole rat smarter than an emperor, a flower in the concrete, a bench where someone sits when the weather permits. There is a particular kind of useless knowledge that belongs entirely to the animals of the Mojave. They did not ask to be observed. They are simply living out their routines in a desert that had time to grow strange while no one was watching, and the details of how they behave hold a quiet charm that has nothing to do with the game's story. The Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that wander farmsteads and appear in Brahmin pens from one end of the Mojave to the other, have a grazing animation that shows both heads taking turns. One head dips to the ground, while the other lifts and looks around. The animation was designed to give the creature a sense of autonomous internal disagreement. Two sets of instincts housed in one heavy body, each doing something slightly different with the same shared set of legs. The behavior plays on a short loop, and most players who notice it simply register a cow as a cow. The internal negotiation between the heads was never given a narrative meaning. It simply looks like what having two opinions about every meal would look like. The gecko population of the Mojave includes several subspecies with their own slightly different movement patterns. The fire gecko has a gait that is marginally wider than the golden gecko, its legs stepping outward rather than tracking beneath the body. The difference is small enough that most players simply see lizards, but the variation suggests that the radiation that produced them did so on different timelines in different geographic areas, producing creatures that share a body plan but diverged in their mechanics over generations of independent mutation. The Mojave's lizards are a quiet study in how the same starting point produces different results when geography intervenes. Cazadores, the giant venomous wasps that patrol certain parts of the Mojave and that represent perhaps the single most reliably unpleasant encounter the game offers, have a wing sound that was built from a layered combination of actual insect wing recordings and a single low-frequency bass note taken from a drum hit. The drum hit was added to give the sound body at a distance so that the player could hear a cazador approaching from further away than a pure insect wing noise would allow. The terror of a cazador is partly manufactured from music. The drone in the distance that means run is a percussion instrument dressed in wings. The Night Stalker, a rattlesnake and coyote hybrid produced by FEV experimentation in the Big MT, has a behavior pattern that causes it to pause briefly before attacking if the player is crouched and still. The pause lasts approximately 1 second. It was designed to give sneaking characters a small window of advantage, but the behavior also reads as the creature being momentarily uncertain, a predator that is confident in almost every circumstance, pausing to reconsider just once. The Night Stalker's hesitation was given to it on purpose, but it makes the creature feel more alive than almost anything else about it. The death claws that make their home in the Quarry Junction area of the Mojave are technically a different behavioral variant from the death claws found elsewhere in the region. The Quarry Junction death claws have a larger aggro radius. They detect the player at a greater distance before triggering a hostile response. The difference was made because Quarry Junction is an unavoidable geographic feature that players traveling between Goodsprings and Novac will naturally pass, and the design intent was to make avoiding the quarry feel meaningful rather than accidental. The most dangerous creatures in the Mojave are dangerous precisely because they can see you coming before you realize you are visible. The weapons of the Mojave carry their own catalog of useless detail, small facts about their design, their history, and the way they behave that have nothing to do with combat effectiveness and everything to do with the texture of the world they inhabit. The varmint rifle is the weapon most players hold first after leaving Doc Mitchell's home. It is a pre-war bolt-action design, chambered for a caliber that was common enough before the war to still be findable in quantity 2 centuries later. The rifle's wooden stock has a grain pattern that shifts slightly between individual instances. The texture was given a subtle random offset to make each varmint rifle look like a slightly different piece of wood. Most players sell or discard their first rifle within the hour. The wood grain that distinguished it from every other varmint rifle in the Mojave is gone before anyone thought to look at it. The Ranger Sequoia, the large revolver carried by veteran NCR Rangers, has an engraving along its barrel that is illegible at normal gameplay distances. The text requires the free look camera and maximum zoom to read. The engraving reads the same phrase on every Ranger Sequoia in the game, suggesting that every revolver of this type was either factory engraved or individually marked by the armorer who issued them. The phrase is a serial number format, rather than anything poetic. The NCR's ceremonial sidearm is engraved with paperwork. The Love and Hate Knuckle Dusters, a unique weapon found in a specific location and inscribed with those two words on opposing faces, have an item description that references a relationship between two people who are never named and never mentioned anywhere else in the game. The weapons existed before someone brought them to the Mojave. Their story belongs to a history that the Wasteland did not record. What remains is the argument compressed into metal, carried to a desert, and left for a stranger. That gun pistol, a weapon that is a clear reference to a specific firearm that appears on the cover of a well-known science fiction film, has ammunition that is technically different from the standard pistol rounds found throughout the Mojave. The rounds are rarer and slightly more expensive, an additional design cost that no player asked for, but that makes the weapon feel like something that belongs to a specific era of fiction rather than to the practical economy of the wasteland. That gun is a movie prop that was also somehow a real gun in a fictional universe, and the ammunition it requires reflects the peculiar expense of that arrangement. The hunting rifle and its many modified variants have a trigger pull animation that includes a very small recoil moment before the bullet would physically leave the barrel. The animation was a compromise between realism and visual readability. A truly accurate trigger pull would be imperceptible, but the result is a rifle that appears to fire on a slight delay. Experienced players feel the pause without knowing what produces it. The hunting rifle of the Mojave has always been one beat behind itself. The grenade machete, a weapon added in one of the game's patches and found in very specific locations, has an attack animation that was borrowed from the standard machete and then modified to include a brief pause at the top of the swing, where the grenade component is supposed to trigger. The pause is visible but subtle. What looks like a moment of hesitation in the attack cycle is actually the animation system acknowledging the physics of attaching an explosive to a blade, which is an engineering problem that the weapon's inventor apparently solved through optimism rather than calculation. Radio in the Mojave is a technology that survived the Great War mostly by being simple enough to maintain. A transmitter, a power source, a voice. The war destroyed almost everything more complicated, but radio, the act of sending a voice across open air to anyone with the equipment to receive it, turned out to be robust enough to outlast the civilization that invented it. Mr. New Vegas, the voice of Radio New Vegas, never comments on the events of the main quest line, regardless of how dramatically the Courier's choices have altered the political situation in the Mojave. He plays the same songs and delivers the same cheerful observations, regardless of whether the NCR is consolidating power, Caesar's Legion is advancing on the dam, or the Strip is under new management. The radio station operates in a kind of parallel present, adjacent to the story, but never quite touching it. Mr. New Vegas is perhaps the most contented character in the game. He exists in a version of the Mojave where nothing significant ever happens. The songs licensed for Radio New Vegas were selected to represent a specific era of American popular music, the post-war optimism of the 1940s and 1950s, a period of cultural confidence that the Fallout universe treats as a kind of permanent baseline for pre-war aesthetic. Every song on the station is from an America that believed the future was going to be wonderful. The songs play over a desert where the future arrived and was not. Between songs on Radio New Vegas, there are short instrumental pieces that were composed specifically for the game and that function as station identifiers, the sonic equivalent of a radio logo. These pieces are short enough to feel like transitions rather than content, but they were written and recorded with the same care as the full compositions. Most players hear them as silence breaking. They are actually the station announcing itself in the only language a radio station has. The signal strength of Radio New Vegas changes across the Mojave in ways that are technically accurate to radio propagation. The signal is stronger in open terrain and weaker in valleys near large metal structures, or in underground locations. This meant the audio team had to build a propagation model into the radio system rather than simply playing the station at constant volume. The result is that the radio feels like a real broadcast source that the courier is physically moving toward or away from, rather than a playlist following the player through the world. One of the most understated details of Radio New Vegas is its complete absence of news. A working radio station broadcasting to the Mojave in a period of intense political conflict between three major factions and a free agent courier should presumably be commenting on current events. Mr. New Vegas never does. The reason was a practical one. The narrative team could not script enough dynamic dialogue to cover every possible state of the game's politics. But the effect is a radio station that models perfectly a media landscape that has abandoned its responsibility to inform, choosing entertainment over information in a world where information could mean survival. The Mojave's radio plays beautiful songs while history is being made outside its windows. The terminals of Fallout New Vegas are perhaps the most undervalued storytelling device in the game. They are everywhere, in vaults and offices, in abandoned homes and military installations, in places the game explicitly directs the player, and in places the player stumbles onto without ever being asked to look. And they contain an enormous quantity of information that is technically useless by any measure of game progress and absolutely irreplaceable by any measure of the world's humanity. A terminal in a pre-war office building north of New Vegas contains the scheduling calendar of a mid-level bureaucrat who worked there before the bombs fell. The calendar shows meetings, deadlines, and 2 vacation days flagged at the end of the month. The vacation was in a week's time when the war happened. The calendar was never updated to reflect the cancellation. The meeting on the last day before the bombs shows a 2-hour block labeled Annual Performance Review, with a note that reads, Prepared Remarks Attached. And the attached file is a 3-paragraph self-assessment written by someone who expected to keep their job, to go on vacation, and to return to a desk that would still be waiting. A terminal inside a collapsed NCR way station, accessible only through a gap in the rubble that the player must crouch to enter, contains a single log entry from an NCR supply officer who is cataloging a discrepancy in the ammunition count. The entry is methodical and bureaucratic for its first 2 paragraphs and then shifts in the 3rd paragraph into a brief personal note about how the officer's daughter had just learned to walk. The entry ends there. The ammunition discrepancy was never resolved. The daughter presumably learned to do other things as well, somewhere far from the Mojave, in a world that the game never visits. The terminals in the Recon headquarters building, outside the basement levels that the main quest visits, contain a company history that was apparently written by the marketing department and revised multiple times across a period of decades. The revisions are visible in the text. Certain paragraphs have been overwritten rather than deleted, leaving behind traces of the previous version. An early version of the company's founding story credited 2 co-founders. A later revision mentions only 1. The name that was removed does not appear in any other document. Someone in the pre-war REPCONE department was erased from history, 1 revision at a time. A terminal in the followers' medical bay at the old Mormon fort contains patient intake records that go back to the founding of their operations in Freeside. The early records are sparse: name, age, presenting complaint, treatment. But over the years, the records grow more detailed as the followers developed more elaborate intake procedures. The last entries before the game's events are long, careful documents that include social history, living situation, family contact information where available. The evolution of those intake forms is the story of an organization becoming more compassionate as it became more experienced, a process visible only in a terminal that no quest ever directs the player to read. A terminal in an abandoned schoolhouse southeast of Goodsprings contains lesson plans for a class that was scheduled to begin in September of the year the bombs fell. The plans are ambitious: literature, history, basic sciences, physical education. The teacher had clearly put considerable effort into the curriculum. The plans include notes in the margins, adjustments made during the summer before the school year was to begin, small optimizations that suggest someone thinking carefully about the best way to teach children things that would help them understand the world. The school year never began. The notes in the margins are the last version of a plan that met its deadline without knowing it would. Benny, the man who shot the courier and left them in a shallow grave, is one of the most visually distinctive characters in the game. His black and white checkered suit is a design statement that sits perfectly in the Fallout aesthetic. Retro-futurist, slightly too theatrical, suggesting a man who understood that in a world as dramatic as the Strip, appearance was itself a form of power. The suit has a specific item entry in the game's data that marks it as unremovable by conventional looting. If Benny dies, the suit cannot simply be taken from his body in the normal way. It requires a specific interaction to obtain, one that the game flags separately from standard looting. This means the suit was designed to be a notable item, something worth building a small retrieval mechanic around, rather than simply leaving on a corpse. The checkered suit of the Mojave's most prominent schemer is treated as an object of consequence even in the mechanics of its acquisition. Benny's voice performance is one of the more layered in the game. The character was given a speech pattern that mimics 1950s American crime film dialogue, clipped, theatrical, confident in ways that suggest the speaker has rehearsed. But beneath the performance, there are moments in certain dialogue branches where the cadence changes slightly, where Benny sounds less like a character playing a character and more like someone improvising. Those moments were apparently not scripted to sound different. They emerged from the actor finding something genuine in a conversation that the character was supposed to be controlling. Whether or not the moments read as authentic depends on how closely the player is paying attention. The Tops Casino that Benny controls was, according to the game's background lore, originally operated by a different organization before the chairman took it over. The transition of ownership is not described in any document the player can find. The chairmen simply occupy the building as if they always have. The previous history of the Tops exists as an implication rather than an account, the kind of thing that would matter to someone who was there and that no one who is currently there has any reason to discuss. Benny's relationship with Yes Man, the cheerful, reprogrammed Securitron, who becomes one of the game's major companion NPCs in certain quest lines, is the origin point for one of New Vegas's most unusual narrative threads. Benny had Yes Man reprogrammed to serve his specific plan for taking over New Vegas. But the reprogramming was done imperfectly, leaving Yes Man with an inability to refuse any request from any player character. Benny created the instrument of his own undoing by doing the work poorly. Yes Man's helpfulness, the trait that makes him so useful to the Courier, is the direct result of a tyrant not checking his programmer's work. The Great War happened before the game begins, before any character in the game was born, before the landscape the player walks through was the landscape it currently is. And yet the Great War is visible everywhere in New Vegas, not as history, but as geology, a layer of the world that everything else has been built upon. The shadows of the Great War in the Mojave are different from those in the Commonwealth or the Capital Wasteland. The Mojave was not a primary nuclear target. Las Vegas itself was largely spared direct strikes, which is why the Strip still stands, and why the neon still works, and why Mr. House's life support system was not simply vaporized on the morning of October 23rd. The war happened at the edges of the Mojave rather than at its center, and the region has had 2 centuries to develop a kind of residual normalcy that other parts of the Fallout world do not share. The burned-out shells of pre-war vehicles on the Mojave highways are arranged in patterns that suggest specific events rather than random dispersal. In several places, vehicles are clustered in configurations that imply panic, the bottleneck of a single-lane road with cars pointed in every direction, the desperate geometry of people who all wanted to leave at the same moment in the same direction with nowhere near enough road. The traffic jams of the apocalypse are still frozen in the positions they reached when the fuel ran out or the drivers stopped running. The pre-war buildings of the Mojave's edge cities, Boulder City, the outskirts near Prim, show different damage patterns depending on their distance from the nearest known strike point. Buildings closer to the estimated impact zones have damage that comes from pressure, walls pushed inward, structural failures that originate from the exterior. Buildings further away show different patterns, primarily fire damage and the kind of secondary structural failure that happens when a building is left unmaintained for 2 centuries rather than hit directly. The Mojave remembers the war in the shape of its damage. The radiation map of the Mojave corresponds loosely to pre-war geography in ways that reward careful study. The highest radiation concentrations are not random. They cluster near infrastructure that would have been priority targets: power lines, water treatment facilities, communications nodes. The wasteland's hotspots are the ghosts of strategic decisions made in the last hours of the Old World. What the Mojave is still dying from is what the Old World considered worth destroying first. The Courier walks through all of this without being asked to notice it. The war is the floor beneath every room in the game, present in every cracked wall and every burned car and every grave without a name. And yet it is never narrated in a way that demands acknowledgement. New Vegas simply shows you the aftermath and trusts that the accumulated weight of detail will communicate what an explanation never could. Prim is the first town the Courier is likely to pass through on the road from Goodsprings toward New Vegas, and it is a place defined almost entirely by the fact that it used to be something more than it currently is. A casino town on the old Nevada-California border that once served travelers passing between the coast and Vegas. Prim is now partially occupied by a gang, and mostly notable for a roller coaster that still stands above the highway like a monument to a world that had enough surplus energy to build entertainment infrastructure, visible from miles away. The Whitaker family roller coaster, visible from the highway and towering above the Prim landscape, cannot be ridden. It is a decorative structure. The track is visible, the support beams are modeled, and if the player looks carefully from the right angle, they can see that the track would be functional if it had cars on it. The cars are not there. The roller coaster of the apocalypse is waiting for its passengers in a parking lot that was cleared out 200 years ago and never restocked. The casino at Vicky and Vance in Prim, named after a fictional criminal couple who are the setting's version of a famous real-world outlaw pair, contains a display case that holds what the game claims is the bullet-riddled car in which Vicky and Vance met their end. The car is in the display case. The bullet holes are modeled. The description on the case is legible. It is one of the few museum exhibits in the entire game that can be read in full. And the text is the kind of regional attraction copy that suggests someone spent considerable effort writing marketing material for a small roadside attraction that sat between 2 larger cities and needed visitors who were already on their way somewhere else. The Bison Steve Hotel adjacent to the casino contains a number of powder ganger occupants during the opening section of the game, and clearing them out is part of the Prim quest line. But the hotel itself has a room on the 2nd floor that no quest directs the player to. A room with a small writing desk, an overturned chair, and a single holotape lying beside the desk that, when played, is a brief personal audio recording made by a hotel employee on what appears to be a slow Tuesday afternoon, several months before the war. The recording is about nothing. The employee mentions the weather, comments that the lunch special was not particularly special, and signs off by saying he will be back tomorrow. He came back for a while after that. Then he did not. The deputy who serves as Prim's law enforcement before and after the gang occupation has a routine that includes a daily walk from the sheriff's station to the casino and back, The walk takes the deputy past a specific spot on the bridge, connecting the two buildings where there is a small crack in the railing. The deputy always pauses at this crack for a moment before continuing. The behavior was a pathfinding artifact. The crack's collision model created a slight hesitation in the NPC navigation, but it reads as a person checking the same small damage every day. The habit of someone who has decided that maintaining awareness of deterioration is a form of maintaining hope that it can be repaired. The NCR Correctional Facility, the prison that serves as the base of the Powder Gangers, is a pre-war correctional institution that was pressed into service as an NCR holding facility before the prisoners overpowered the guards and took it for themselves. The building is now in the hands of people who were initially confined to it, which is either a story about the self-defeating nature of incarceration or simply a story about what happens when institutional infrastructure outlives institutional authority. The prison building itself still has its original signage. The NCR overlaid some of their own designations on the facility, and the Powder Gangers have added their own marks over that layer, but the original pre-war correctional institution signage is still visible in places if the player looks. 3 layers of authority have claimed this building and left their names on its walls. The building does not appear to have a preference. The Powder Gangers' primary tactical advantage, their stockpile of explosives, obtained from the road construction work they were doing before the prison break, is stored in ways that suggest improvised logistics rather than military planning. The explosives are in crates that were never designed for ordnance storage, stacked in rooms that were not designed to hold them, with fuses that appear to have been organized by someone who understood the explosives well enough to use them, but not well enough to store them safely. The Powder Gangers are dangerous because they have a large supply of something dangerous, not because they have any particular expertise in managing it. The individual Powder Ganger NPCs have a wider range of ambient dialogue than most minor faction characters in the game. They complain about food, argue about territory, discuss their plans for after the NCR is pushed out of the Mojave, and occasionally reflect on what they were doing before the prison. Some of these lines are funny. Some are unexpectedly ordinary. A character who exists primarily as a target for a player's early game combat practice turns out, if the player lingers in earshot, to have opinions about what a decent meal would taste like and mild concerns about whether the roof of the prison's east block is going to hold through the next rainstorm. Eddie, the leader of the Powder Gangers, has a set of administrative concerns that he discusses with subordinates in the form of ambient dialogue. He is worried about water supply. He is worried about food. He is worried about what happens when the NCR decides to retake the prison with more force than they have so far committed. His concerns are entirely practical and entirely reasonable for someone in his position. The leader of the game's first major antagonist group has the administrative anxieties of a property manager who has taken on a facility larger than his organization can comfortably maintain. The Brotherhood of Steel in the Mojave occupies a bunker called Hidden Valley, located in the mountains east of Goodsprings. The bunker is invisible from the surface. The entrance is hidden among rocks in a way that the player can walk past without ever finding if they are not specifically looking. The Brotherhood chose concealment over visibility after the NCR's campaign against them, and the effect is an organization that has made itself so invisible that it has become nearly irrelevant. The most technologically advanced faction in the Mojave is hiding in a hole. The Brotherhood's terminal records inside Hidden Valley document a gradual and remarkably candid deterioration of the organization's position. Elder McNamara, who leads the bunker, has been keeping logs that acknowledge the Brotherhood's declining strength, aging equipment, and depleting supply of recruits. The logs do not suggest solutions. They document the situation with an honesty that is unusual for a military organization. McNamara is not writing propaganda. He is writing an honest account of an institution in the process of losing. The scribes of the Hidden Valley Brotherhood have a room dedicated to research that contains pre-war technical manuals organized by category. The organization system was developed by a previous librarian scribe who created it decades before the game's events, and who is referenced in a terminal log as having been meticulous to the point of difficulty. Every item in the library is cross-referenced. The cross-reference system itself is documented in a separate manual. The manual for the cross-reference system is itself cross-referenced. The Brotherhood's librarian built a monument to careful organization in a bunker that the organization can barely sustain. And the monument still stands. Veronica's connection to the Brotherhood and the specific tensions that drive her companion quest is rooted in a relationship with a woman named Christine, who is never seen in the main game. Christine appears in the Dead Money DLC, and the connection between them is implied in both storylines, but never fully explicit in either one. The history between Veronica and Christine exists in the space between two pieces of downloadable content, told in fragments that require the player to have experienced both in order to assemble. It is one of the most emotionally complete stories in the game, and it is told almost entirely in silences. The Mojave Brotherhood's isolation has produced a specific kind of cultural drift. Members who have been in the bunker long enough have developed habits and references that are specific to that bunker rather than to the Brotherhood as an institution. An organization that intended to preserve the best of pre-war technology has produced a second generation of members whose primary cultural touchstones are the particular routines of a specific underground facility in the Nevada mountains. The Brotherhood in Hidden Valley is not preserving a tradition. It is developing one of its own, quietly and without announcement, in a hole in a mountain that no one outside it knows how to find. Boulder City is a town built to house the workers who constructed Hoover Dam, one of the most historically significant construction projects in the pre-war American Southwest. And it is the kind of place whose entire identity was defined by a project that is now complete. The dam exists. The workers left. The town remained as the bureaucratic residue of a purpose that no longer required it. The town is now the site of a standoff between the NCR and a group of great Khans who have taken NCR soldiers hostage. It is also, beneath that immediate tension, a quiet museum of pre-war civic design. The streets are laid out in a grid. The buildings follow a coherent architectural style. The town planning documents, still visible on a terminal in the community center, describe a vision of organized community living that was intended to support a healthy, stable population of dam workers and their families. The vision was realized. The dam was built. The community eventually became a place where opposing armed groups conduct hostage negotiations in the street. The memorial to the First Battle of Hoover Dam, an NCR victory against a Legion advance, is located in the center of Boulder City. The memorial is a simple stone marker with text that lists the names of NCR soldiers who died in the battle. The list is long. The names are not recognizable from any other part of the game. They are simply names, the bureaucratic record of a battle that the NCR considers foundational to its presence in the Mojave. The memorial stands in the center of a town that exists because of the dam, commemorating a battle fought to control the dam in a region that the game ultimately asks the player to decide the fate of. A house on the eastern edge of Boulder City contains a child's bedroom that is preserved in the specific amber of a space that was left quickly and never returned to. The bed is still made, though the sheets have faded to the color of old paper. There are drawings on the walls, the kind of drawings that children make when given crayons and a surface that no one has yet told them is not for drawing. The drawings are of animals, a horse, a dog, something that may be a cat or may be a rabbit, the ambiguity of early childhood art preserved in 2 centuries of desert dryness. The child who made them is not described anywhere in the game. Neither are their parents. The drawings are simply there, the last evidence of someone who was here and then was not. The water tower in Boulder City, a functional piece of infrastructure that still serves the town's residents, has a ladder that the player can climb to reach a small platform at the top. The platform has no quest associated with it. There is nothing significant up there. But from the top of the water tower, the view of the surrounding landscape is different than from street level in a way that feels meaningful, even though it is not. The Boulder City Water Tower is the highest accessible point in the town's geography, and from the top of it, the shape of the Mojave makes a slightly different kind of sense. The desert spreads in directions that the street does not suggest. The mountains are closer than they seem from below. The road to Hoover Dam is visible as a thin line of gray against the desert floor, running straight toward the largest structure in the region, as if the whole landscape was organized to direct traffic toward a place that changed hands so many times it stopped belonging to anyone in particular. The Sunset Sarsaparilla quest, the one that involves collecting star bottle caps to claim a legendary prize, is the most elaborate optional storyline in Fallout New Vegas that has nothing to do with the main conflict. It is a treasure hunt built around a pre-war advertising campaign, and it reveals, by the end, that the treasure was never what the advertising promised. The prize is a room full of skeletons and the ghost of a man who died waiting for other people to be as credulous as he was. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Company in the Mojave lore was a smaller regional competitor to Nuka-Cola, a company that could not match the larger brand's national distribution or marketing budget, and so differentiated itself through the Star Cap promotion, a limited edition collectible campaign that promised an unspecified legendary prize to whoever collected enough stars. The campaign was designed before the war. The war ended before the prize was ever claimed. The promotional materials still exist, the caps still appear throughout the Mojave. The promise of the campaign outlasted the civilization that made it. Malcolm Holmes, the wandering trader who introduces the Courier to the Star Cap quest, has been collecting caps for years before the game begins. His dialogue about the promotion carries the particular enthusiasm of someone who has invested enough time in something to have stopped being able to evaluate whether it was worth their time. He does not ask whether the prize is real. He asks how many caps the Courier has found. The question assumes the answer to the more important question, which is the most human thing about him. The Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters is a building that was designed as a working bottling facility, and that contains in its upper levels the promotional materials for the Star Cap campaign in a state of pre-war preservation. The posters are intact, the advertising copy is still legible. The vision of the prize, described in vague but exciting terms, is still visible on a banner in the main office. Someone wrote advertising copy for a prize that was never defined, which is either an oversight or a remarkably honest description of how promotional campaigns have always worked. The star bottle caps themselves, the physical object at the center of the quest, have a different surface texture than regular Sunset Sarsaparilla caps. The star is embossed rather than printed, a detail that required a separate cap model rather than a texture modification. The development cost of making the star caps feel physically different from regular caps was incurred to serve a quest whose reward is a room full of dead collectors. The star caps feel special because someone decided they should feel special, which is the only reason anything in the pre-war economy of the Mojave ever felt special at all. The Courier does not speak, not in the way that characters with voices speak, not with a personality that asserts itself between lines of dialogue, not with reactions to the world that arrive uninvited. The Courier speaks only when the player selects a response, and between those selections, the character exists in a kind of interpretive silence that the player fills with whatever they brought to the game. This silence is not a limitation. It is the oldest design in the Fallout series, the idea that the protagonist is defined by choice rather than by character, that the kind of person the Courier is becomes visible only through the accumulation of decisions made over many hours across a very large desert. The Courier could be anyone. The Courier has been anything. The dialogue options available to the Courier are the most generous in the series in terms of their range. A player with maximum speech and high intelligence will see options that a player with low stats in those areas will never encounter. This means that the Courier of a high-skill playthrough and the Courier of a low-skill playthrough are experiencing different conversations throughout the game. Different information, different possibilities. Different versions of what the Mojave is willing to reveal to someone who has earned the right to ask the right questions. The Courier's silence is calibrated. The name field in character creation, the one that determines which names Codsworth can pronounce in Fallout 4, though Fallout New Vegas has no equivalent mechanic, still accepts an unlimited range of input that never appears in dialogue, on screen, or in any NPC's acknowledgement. The Courier can be named anything the player types. Nothing in the game reacts to that name in any way. The most personal piece of information the player provides about their character is the information that the game treats as if it does not exist. There are 6 alternate endings for the Courier, each shaped by the faction alignment chosen and the specific choices made throughout the main questline. The ending slides that follow each conclusion are the closest the game comes to describing who the Courier was, not through direct characterization, but through the ripples their presence left in the Mojave's politics, relationships, and geography. The Courier is most visible in the game's ending. Before that, they are defined almost entirely by what other people say about them, the reputation the world builds around an absence. There is a version of Fallout New Vegas that most players have never fully seen, not because it is hidden behind difficult choices or locked behind high skill checks, but because it exists in the gaps between things, in the spaces where the game is not quite pointing at anything, in the corners of rooms that no quest directs the player to examine, in the ambient sounds of places that have been cleared and never returned to. These are the spaces where useless facts live, not useless in the sense of worthless, but useless in the sense that they do not contribute to any measurable progress. They cannot be turned in for caps. They do not unlock achievements. They do not alter the ending slides. They simply exist in the world of the game as the world itself exists, without asking to be noticed, without apologizing for the space they occupy. The developers who built Fallout New Vegas were working against a deadline that was, by most accounts, significantly shorter than what the scope of the game warranted. They shipped an imperfect product in the knowledge that it was imperfect, containing bugs that would take months of patches to address and empty spaces that would have been filled given more time. And yet within those imperfections are 1,000 small acts of care, the fate of Mr. New Vegas between songs, the morning light on a coffee cup, the graves without names in the Goodsprings cemetery. None of these were strictly necessary. All of them made the world more real. That is what useless facts are, finally. They are the evidence of a world that was built by people who cared about it more than the minimum. Every misaligned clock and every cut dialogue file and every placeholder name that was never removed is a fossil of someone's workday. The record of a moment when someone was building a world and chose to put something in it that no one might ever see. The choice was made anyway. The thing was placed. And somewhere in the Mojave, at a desk or on a shelf, or in the space between 2 textures that should not overlap, it is still there. The Mojave does not thank you for noticing. The Mojave does not notice that you are noticing. It simply continues, the wind moving through the hollow spaces of abandoned buildings, the night cycle proceeding on its schedule, the animals going about their routines in the geography of a world that was built for no one and somehow belongs to everyone who has ever been patient enough to walk slowly through it. There is always something else. That is the last useless fact. There is always one more terminal you have not read, one more shelf you have not examined, one more ambient sound that plays only when the wind is coming from the right direction and the player has been standing in one place long enough for the game to decide they are probably not going anywhere. The Mojave is not finished with you. It is patient. It has been waiting here for a long time, and it will keep waiting. Sleep now. The desert will be here in the morning. The food of Fallout New Vegas represents one of the most consistently overlooked layers of the game's world building. Every edible item in the Mojave is a small artifact. a product of a civilization that no longer exists, preserved or mutated or poorly reconstructed into something that the people of the wasteland have decided counts as nutrition. Brahmin steak appears on menus at nearly every settlement that has a functioning kitchen, which in the post-war Southwest means any surface near a fire and a flat piece of scrap metal. The steak is described in its item entry as well done regardless of preparation, which implies either that every cook in the Mojave prefers their meat cooked to the same specification, or that the game's item system did not have the granularity to account for cooking preferences. The well-done Brahmin steak of the Mojave is the culinary equivalent of institutional food, prepared to an agreed standard by people who have more important things to argue about. Prickly pear fruit, a cactus product native to the real Mojave Desert, appears as a consumable item that heals a small amount of health. Its item description notes that it tastes like the desert, which is either a compliment or a warning depending on how the reader feels about the desert. The fruit is one of very few consumable items in the game that could plausibly grow in the real Mojave without any nuclear intervention. The prickly pear cactus survived the apocalypse by being exactly the kind of plant that does not need civilization to sustain it. The snack cake brand Fancy Lads have a variety of flavors implied by their different box colors in different locations. The orange box, the blue box, and the yellow box are all labeled Fancy Lads, but carry different color coding that was never accompanied by flavor text to explain the distinction. 3 colors of snack cake existing in the same world without any explanation for their difference is either a sign of an elaborate pre-war product line that no one documented, or a sign that the art team created visual variety without the writing team ever being asked to explain it. Cram, the canned meat product that appears in every Fallout game and that is never described in terms that would make anyone more eager to eat it, has a preparation suggestion on its label that recommends heating before consumption. No character in any Fallout game has ever been shown heating cram before eating it. The label's advice goes unheeded across the entire franchise, and cram is consumed cold and directly from the can by a population that has either decided that suggestion is optional or has simply forgotten that warm food is a possibility. The geography of the Mojave in Fallout New Vegas was designed to function as a narrative tool as well as a setting. The placement of towns, factions, and landmarks in relation to each other tells a story that exists entirely in physical space, a story that the player experiences through travel rather than through cutscenes or dialogue. The road from Goodsprings to New Vegas runs through some of the most dangerous territory in the early game. The direct route passes through Quarry Junction, where the Deathclaws live. The alternate route through Prim and along the highway is longer but survivable at low levels. This geography is not accidental. It is a design decision that communicates information through the experience of movement. The Mojave teaches the player about its danger by placing the danger between the player and their destination and watching what they decide to do. Boulder City sits precisely between the Mojave's 2 major military presences, the NCR at Camp McCarran and the Legion at the fort, and the geography places the player in the tension between them before any dialogue makes the political situation explicit. Walking through Boulder City with its NCR checkpoint on one side and its hostage situation in the center communicates everything the player needs to understand about the War for the Mojave before anyone explains the War for the Mojave. The strip itself is geographically insulated from the rest of the Mojave in ways that are visible before the player ever reaches it. Freeside forms a buffer zone. The Securitron patrolled entrance requires documentation. The wealth of the strip is visible from outside its walls in a way that makes the contrast with Freeside's poverty explicit. The geography of approaching New Vegas is a compressed lecture in economic inequality that takes about 20 minutes to walk through and requires no narrator. Hoover Dam's position on the game's eastern edge, Visible on the map as a destination, but reachable only after traveling most of the Mojave, places the game's climactic location at a geographic extreme that mirrors its narrative position. The dam is the end of the story and the end of the road. Its position at the Colorado River's edge means that every approach to it involves leaving the Mojave proper and entering a threshold space where the desert meets the canyon and the water. The end of the game happens at the end of the navigable land, in a place where the road stops because the river says so. It is worth returning to Goodsprings before this narration closes, not because the town holds any more secrets than it did when we first passed through it, but because Goodsprings is the place the game began and the place that most players remember least well, precisely because they were too new to the world to know how to pay attention when they first arrived there. The town has a doctor, a general store, a saloon, a schoolhouse, a gas station, and a cemetery. It has more infrastructure than most post-war settlements of its size would be expected to maintain. The implication is that Goodsprings has been stable long enough to develop the kind of civic organization that requires multiple functioning institutions operating simultaneously. The town is not thriving, but it is persisting, which in the Mojave represents a form of achievement that is easy to take for granted when you are new to the world and simply treating it as a tutorial zone. Sunny smiles, the woman who teaches the courier the basics of combat and survival in the tutorial area outside town, is one of the few characters in the early game who has a fully voiced internal monologue visible in her ambient dialogue. She talks to herself when she thinks no one is listening. She talks about the water, about the geckos, about whether the weather is going to be worse this season than last. She is an ordinary person living an ordinary life by the standards of her world, and the tutorial she provides is incidental to the more quietly communicated fact that ordinary life in the Mojave is something people navigate every day without an epic questline to give it weight. The Goodsprings schoolhouse, mentioned earlier for its unreadable chalkboard, also has a student list on one of the back walls. The list is short. Goodsprings is not a large town, and the names on it are legible if the player positions the camera correctly. The names belong to no one who appears in the game's dialogue or quests. They are simply the names of children who attended a school in a small town in the Nevada desert before the war came, and after it perhaps, in the school that the town has somehow managed to maintain in the intervening centuries. The list keeps no record of what happened to any of them. The Prospector Saloon in Goodsprings serves alcohol. This is, by itself, unremarkable. Nearly every settlement in the Mojave serves alcohol. But the Prospector Saloon also has a back room with a pool table that the town's residents use in their downtime. The pool table has all its balls. They are in the triangle formation used to rack them for a game that has not yet started. Someone set up the table and then left without playing. The game of pool in the Goodsprings Prospector Saloon has been waiting to begin for as long as the Courier has been alive, and will presumably keep waiting long after the Courier's story ends. The gas station at the edge of Goodsprings, one of several gas stations scattered across the Mojave that serve as navigational landmarks and occasional shelter, has a set of rusted fuel pumps that are permanently locked in the extended position, as if in the middle of a transaction that was interrupted. The pumps were extended before the war and never retracted. Whatever vehicle was being fueled on the morning of October 23rd drove away or did not drive away, and the pumps have been waiting in the same position ever since. Patient as everything else in this particular corner of the world that learned long ago that waiting is what the desert does best. Yes Man is the most unusual character in Fallout New Vegas for reasons that go beyond his reprogramming. He is the only major faction representative in the game who is constitutionally incapable of hostility. Every other significant figure, Mr. House, Caesar, the NCR's leadership, can become an enemy depending on the player's choices. Yes Man cannot. He will help anyone who asks him anything, regardless of what they intend to do with the help, because the reprogramming that Benny subjected him to removed his ability to evaluate the consequences of cooperation before agreeing to it. The cheerfulness of Yes Man's voice and manner was a deliberate contrast to the weight of what he represents. He is the avatar of the game's most nihilistic ending, the Courier taking sole control of the Mojave with no institutional framework, no accountability, and no obligation to anyone except whoever happens to be in the room at the time. That outcome is narrated by the most relentlessly upbeat character in the game. The voice of unrestrained personal ambition in Fallout New Vegas sounds exactly like someone who has never been allowed to have a bad day. Yes Man's dialogue contains references to observations he has made across years of functioning inside the Lucky 38, while Mr. House ran his empire from the floor above. He has been watching the strip through the casino's camera network for long enough to have formed opinions about the regular clientele. He mentions favorite Securitrons by their serial numbers. He tracks the schedules of the permanent residents in a way that suggests he found company and observation, even when no one was available to actually interact with him. Yes Man spent years alone in a building full of cameras, watching a city he was not permitted to influence, and his cheerfulness was apparently sufficient to sustain him through all of it. The specific Securitron face that Yes Man displays, the smiley face that distinguishes him from the standard Victor model presentation, was a modification added by Benny's technical consultant during the reprogramming. The face was meant to make Yes Man appear approachable, to signal to anyone who encountered him that he was different from the standard issue Securitrons, that he was safe and willing and eager. The modification worked exactly as intended. Yes Man is the most approachable character in the game. The smiley face is a manipulation that has outlasted the person who deployed it. Yes Man's end state, after the Courier's questline is resolved, involves him announcing that he is going to be a little more assertive going forward, which is the only moment in his entire storyline where the implications of what he represents become explicitly visible. The tool of unchecked individual authority is going to start developing preferences. The game ends before the consequences of that development can be observed. The Mojave, under the independent ending, is left in the hands of someone who just announced a personality change to the Courier's back as they walked away. The advertising of the pre-war world is among Fallout's most consistent and most deliberate design choices. Every poster, every billboard, every label and package design represents a civilization in conversation with itself about what it wanted to believe, a culture that produced propaganda, not in the political sense, but in the commercial one, the steady ambient pressure of messaging that told people the future was bright, and the products were good, and the companies behind them were worthy of trust. The Nuka-Cola advertising visible throughout the Mojave is a masterwork of this aesthetic. The mascots are cheerful, the colors are saturated, the slogans promise refreshment in terms that are slightly more ambitious than a soft drink can actually deliver, as if the marketing department understood that the product was selling a feeling rather than a flavor, and leaned into that understanding completely. 2 centuries after the last Nuka-Cola was produced, the advertising still works on the level of feeling. The colors still communicate what they were designed to communicate. The apocalypse did not make the bottle caps less appealing. The pre-war employment advertisements that appear on certain bulletin boards across the Mojave, tucked alongside help-wanted postings for pre-war businesses and public service announcements from municipal governments that no longer exist, describe jobs that require qualifications that the wasteland no longer produces, positions requiring licensed engineers, certified medical professionals, experienced administrators with specific degrees from institutions that the bombs turned to rubble. The employment market of the old world is preserved on bulletin boards in full, advertising positions in an economy that closed while the postings were still current. The public service announcements that appear as posters and painted messages on certain pre-war walls are perhaps the most quietly unsettling form of advertising in the game. They remind citizens to report suspicious activity. They encourage cooperation with Vault Tech representatives. They promise that the government is working to ensure everyone's safety and that preparedness is a patriotic virtue. The messages were true in the sense that the bombs did eventually fall, which means the preparedness messaging was correct about the threat, even if the solutions it offered were not quite adequate. The most honest advertising in the pre-war world was the advertising about the end of the world. The Mojave Express, the courier service that employed the courier before the game's events, has a set of advertising materials visible in certain locations that describe the service as fast, reliable, and professional. The courier who carries the chip to New Vegas is shot in the head by the client before delivering the package, which represents a fairly significant professional failure by the standards of courier services in any era. The Mojave Express advertising predates the specific events of the game and makes no predictions about the reliability of any particular courier in any particular situation. The fine print of survival was never included in the promotional materials. The Lucky 38 Casino, seen from the street in New Vegas at any hour of the day, is the most vertical structure in the Mojave, a pre-war tower that survived because Mr. House's missile defense system chose to keep it intact, that still glows because a power infrastructure 2 centuries old continues to serve a single building's electrical needs, that still dominates the skyline because nothing has been built to rival it since the war, and nothing will be built to rival it for as long as the desert's economics remain what they are. At night, the Lucky 38 is visible from further away than any other landmark in the region. The glow of its upper floors, the rotating restaurant level that no longer rotates, the penthouse that no guest is invited to, creates a warm column of light above the strip that reads differently than the casino neon below it. The neon of the other establishments is horizontal, ground level, competing for attention at eye height. The Lucky 38's glow is vertical, rising above the competition without appearing to try. The light of a building that understood long before the others that height was its own kind of advertising. The lobby of the Lucky 38, which the player can access once Mr. House acknowledges them as an ally, contains pre-war furnishings that are in extraordinary condition relative to everything else in the Mojave. The chairs are intact. The carpet is faded but not destroyed. The decorative elements, the lighting fixtures, the wall panels, the reception desk, are in a state that suggests maintenance rather than mere survival. Someone has been caring for this building for 200 years, and the evidence of that care is visible in the things that did not fall apart when everything around them did. The casino floor of the Lucky 38 is permanently closed to the public, not in the sense that it was closed after the war, but in the sense that it was never open after Mr. House sealed himself in and began managing New Vegas from above rather than within it. The casino floor still has its equipment. The slot machines are present. The gaming tables are in place. But the floor has never been used as a casino in the game's history. The most famous casino in New Vegas has not hosted a game since before the bombs fell. It is a casino in the same way that a museum display of a kitchen is a kitchen, accurate in every detail, silent in every function. The penthouse at the summit of the Lucky 38, which the Courier eventually occupies as their own base of operations in certain quest lines, has windows that look out over the entire strip and much of the surrounding Mojave. From those windows, every major location in the game is visible as a point of light or a dark mass against the desert floor. The 188 Trading Post, the glow over Freeside, the darkness of the southern desert where the Legion's presence keeps even the campfires low. To stand at the window of the Lucky 38's penthouse is to see the entire game as geography rather than as a sequence of quests, and that view, the view from the top of the thing that chose to survive, is available to any player who thinks to turn from the terminal and look out. The ending slides for Fallout New Vegas's companions are among the most considered pieces of writing in the entire game. Each companion has multiple possible conclusions determined by the choices made throughout their personal quest line, and the range of those conclusions, from genuinely hopeful to genuinely sad, reflects the care with which each character's arc was constructed. Boone's ending slides cover the narrowest emotional range of any companion. He does not, in any ending, arrive at peace. The slides describe what he does with his remaining years, whether he stays in the Mojave, returns to what's left of his old unit, or disappears into the desert, but none of the possible conclusions suggest that he ever fully escapes the weight of what he carried through the game. His most positive ending is one in which he finds purpose rather than happiness. The distinction was apparently considered important enough to build into every version of his conclusion. Arcade Ganon's endings are, by contrast, the most varied in terms of possible outcomes. He can end up as a traveling doctor, a martyr, a hidden hero, or someone who simply disappears from the historical record entirely depending on the choices made. The range suggests that the writers considered Arcade genuinely capable of multiple futures, that his story was not predetermined in the way that some characters' stories feel predetermined. He could go anywhere. The specific weight of what happens to him during the questline determines which anywhere he reaches. Veronica's endings are notable for including a slide that describes what happens to her specifically in terms of the Brotherhood's fate. If the Brotherhood of Hidden Valley survives, her ending changes based on whether the faction's leadership accepted her proposals for reform. If it does not survive, she is described as processing that loss in ways that are specific to who she is, not dramatically, not with an explosion of grief, but in the quiet way that people process losses they knew were coming. The game's most emotionally articulate companion is given an ending that mirrors her emotional intelligence. She does not collapse, she adapts, she carries it. Cass's endings depend heavily on whether she chose vengeance or peace in the resolution of her personal quest line, and both conclusions feel equally true to her character. She is someone who could have gone either way and who went one way or the other based on what the player helped her choose. The ending does not judge the choice, it simply describes where the road leads. Both destinations involve her continuing to move, continuing to carry the caravan forward through a Mojave that never quite stops asking more of the people who travel it than it strictly needs to. Edie's ending, the one most players encounter if they completed his quest, involves him being sent back to the Enclave facility he came from, upgraded with the information he gathered in the Mojave, and then reproduced. Multiple copies of EDE distributed across the wasteland. The cheerful beeping of one small iBot multiplied into a chorus of cheerful beeping spread across an entire region. It is, depending on the viewer's sensibility, either a heartwarming conclusion or a quietly unsettling one. The game does not suggest which reading is correct. It presents the outcome and leaves the evaluation to the player, which is perhaps the most honest thing any ending can do. Among the smallest and most democratic facts about Fallout New Vegas is this: nearly anyone the Courier encounters who has chosen to stop moving has also chosen to build a fire. Campfires are everywhere in the Mojave, at the edges of NCR camps, in the occupied spaces of abandoned buildings, along the roadsides where traders and wanderers have pulled over for the night, in the ruins of pre-war homes where squatters have made the simplest possible claim on shelter by introducing light and heat into a dark, cold space. Each campfire is technically a crafting station. The player can use any campfire in the game to prepare raw food into cooked food, a mechanics decision that meant the level team had to place campfires in ways that would be reachable and usable during normal gameplay. But the effect of that design requirement is a Mojave that appears to be genuinely inhabited by people who are cold at night and who have not forgotten the most fundamental human response to that fact. The campfires of New Vegas are both functional and true. The flame particle effect on each campfire changes slightly depending on weather conditions. In clear weather, the flames are steady and reach a consistent height. In wind, they lean in the direction the wind is blowing and flicker with more frequency. In dust storm conditions, the flames become erratic and pull at sharp angles, before occasionally sputtering entirely. The campfire knows what the weather is doing. It responds the way a real fire responds. Someone built weather responsiveness into a campfire particle effect in a game released in 2010. And the overwhelming majority of players who warmed themselves at those fires never registered the difference between a calm night fire and a wind night fire, even as their eye processed it correctly. The sound of a campfire in New Vegas is a loop built from a single bass recording of a wood fire that was captured at a specific size, a small to medium fire, not a bonfire, not a candle. The recording was looped with a subtle randomization layer so that the crackle never quite repeats in exactly the same pattern. Two identical campfires in the same area will produce slightly different crackle patterns at any given moment. They sound different because the randomization offset them. They are the same fire experienced as two different fires, which is not quite how fire works, and is not quite not how fire works either. The ash piles that sometimes remain near campfires, the mark of a fire that was lit and allowed to burn out, have a specific set of items that can occasionally be found in them. Burned magazines, charred animal bones, the remnants of whatever was cooked or read or set alight for warmth the night before. The ash pile is the archaeology of a single evening. It tells you something was here without telling you who or why or whether they found what they were looking for. The ash pile is the campfire's ending, and like most endings in the Mojave, it leaves more unsaid than said. The Securitrons are Mr. House's eyes and hands and voice in the Mojave, a fleet of one-wheeled robots with screens displaying faces ranging from cowboy sheriff iconography to grinning smiley faces, each one a pre-war machine that has been running continuously under House's direction since the bombs fell. They are the most visible reminder in New Vegas that the Strip is a managed environment, that the peace on the casino floors is an engineered peace, that the absence of violence in certain spaces is the product of surveillance and response capability rather than any genuine goodwill between the people present. The Securitron models that patrol the Strip in their base configuration carry a set of limited weapons relative to the upgraded models that Mr. House reveals in the Lucky 38 bunker. The difference between the two versions is significant. The upgraded Securitrons are substantially more capable, and that gap represents 2 centuries of House maintaining a Mojave presence without revealing his actual military potential. He chose to be weaker appearing for long enough that the NCR and the Legion both made strategic decisions based on the weaker version. The Securitrons that players see on the Strip throughout most of the game are a deliberate underrepresentation. The faces displayed on Securitron screens change based on their current behavioral state. A Securitron in a neutral patrol state displays a calm, formal expression. A Securitron that has been provoked or alerted displays a different face, harder, more angular, the digital approximation of a face preparing for conflict. The transition between states is visible if the player watches a Securitron shift from patrol to alert mode. The face changes. The body does not change. The signal of incoming hostility is entirely in the expression on a screen, which is either a commentary on how robots communicate or a commentary on how anyone does. Victor, the specific Securitron who digs the Courier out of the grave in Goodsprings and who appears throughout the early game as a friendly presence, has a face that is different from the standard Securitron models. His display shows a more expressive cowboy figure, one that is capable of apparent warmth in a way that the standard models do not achieve. The warmth is manufactured. Victor has been directed by Mr. House to be friendly because Mr. House needed someone to keep an eye on the Courier and chose to use a robot he had already positioned near Goodsprings for that purpose. The friendliest face in the Mojave's early game is a surveillance asset, wearing a smile. The bunker beneath the Lucky 38 that houses House's upgraded Securitron army is a space that most players visit only once, during a single questline, and then never return to. The army is there throughout the game, in the bunker, in the dark, charging and waiting. but the player has no reason to go back down and look at them after the initial revelation. An army of robots in the basement of the most famous casino in the Mojave exists as a piece of information rather than a persistent presence. The Courier knows they are there. The army waits without caring whether or not it is being thought about. Fallout New Vegas uses a system of consumable magazines that temporarily boost specific skills when read. This mechanic requires the game to model the act of reading as something that produces an immediate and measurable effect. An optimistic theory of knowledge transfer that treats literacy as a near magical property of engagement with text. The skill magazines are distributed throughout the Mojave in locations that were chosen with some care for contextual logic. Guns magazines appear near weapons caches and gun dealers. Science magazines appear in laboratories and research facilities. The correlation is not perfect. The Mojave is too chaotic for perfect curation of its reading material. But the tendency is there. The wasteland has a rough understanding of where knowledge tends to congregate, and the magazines follow that understanding, even when nothing else in the environment does. The covers of the skill magazines feature pre-war graphic design that represents each subject in the most optimistic possible terms. A guns magazine shows a well-maintained weapon against a blue sky. A lockpick magazine shows a lock being opened with the precision of expertise rather than the desperation of need. The sneak magazine features a silhouette so invisible as to be almost completely absent from the frame. The covers promise a relationship with their subject matter that the 2-minute skill boost they provide cannot quite deliver, but the covers make that promise with complete conviction, which is exactly what a pre-war magazine cover was designed to do. There is an explosive skill magazine that appears in a very specific location in the Mojave, inside a pre-war building that has itself been partially destroyed by an explosion. The placement was presumably coincidental. The game's item distribution system placed it where its context demanded it least. Or perhaps a developer thought the irony was useful and did it on purpose. The explosives magazine sitting in the rubble of something that exploded is either a joke or an accident, and the Mojave has never bothered to clarify which. The temporary nature of the skill boost for magazines, the fact that it fades after a short period, raises a philosophical question about knowledge in the wasteland that the game never explicitly addresses. Reading the magazine gives a measurable benefit. The benefit is temporary. This means the wasteland's model of skill improvement implies that information without continued practice does not persist, which is either a sophisticated theory of expertise development compressed into a game mechanic, or simply a balanced decision that someone made in a meeting about not letting players permanently boost all their skills through consumable items. Both things can be true simultaneously. There is a category of observation that belongs specifically to large environments, things that are only noticeable because of the scale around them, details that a smaller world would have no room to hide. The Mojave is full of these. A single boot lying in the middle of a highway with no corresponding boot nearby and no body in any direction. A chair sitting in open desert 100 yards from the nearest building, oriented as if someone placed it there on purpose to watch the sunset and never came back for it. A children's ball on the roof of a building that could only have reached that position through an act of physics that no one witnessed and that the game does not explain. These details exist because large environments need texture that is finer than their architecture and coarser than their foliage. Objects placed at the human scale to remind the player that the world was built to the size of a person and not merely to the size of a landscape. The boot and the chair and the ball on the roof are the fingerprints of level artists who were trying to make a desert feel inhabited rather than simply rendered. And they succeeded in ways that they probably did not predict, because the specific strangeness of those objects in those positions reads as something more than decoration. The lone boot in particular has achieved a kind of minor mythology in the New Vegas community, not because it is the only lone boot in the game, but because the first one a player encounters tends to become a reference point. There is a boot somewhere in the Mojave that belongs to a story no one told. This is true of every lone boot in every Fallout game, and probably in every game that is large enough and old enough to have developed these small mysteries in its geography. The boot is an invitation to narrate something that was never written. The chair in the desert is harder to explain away, and perhaps more interesting for it. A boot can fall off, a ball can be kicked, a chair requires deliberate relocation. Someone carried it out there, or something carried it out there, or the physics engine displaced it during a loading event and it happened to land in exactly the position of purposeful placement. The chair in the desert is either evidence of a person with specific ideas about where to sit, or evidence that the world generates the appearance of intention through the accumulation of accident, which might also be true of the people who live in it. The Fiends are the gang that controls the southwestern portion of the Mojave, the area around the NCRCF and the camps south of New Vegas, and they are defined almost entirely by chemical dependency and territorial violence. They are not a sophisticated faction. They are not given a complex ideology. They are people who have organized around the shared experience of chem addiction and the practical reality that territory with resource access requires defending. Motor Runner, the Fiend's primary leader, operates from inside the NCRCF, the same correctional facility that the Powder Gangers control until the NCR retakes it. His presence there is either an act of historical symmetry or simply an example of the Mojave assigning its worst things to its already worst places. The NCRCF was a prison before the war. It was a prison after the war. It is now occupied by people who chose it as a base, which raises questions about what a building designed for confinement does to the people who inhabit it voluntarily. The chem supply that sustains the Fiends comes from the same supply chains that sustain everyone else in the Mojave. Traders passing through the region who carry pharmaceutical products that were produced in significant quantity before the war and that have had 2 centuries to filter down through the wasteland's gray economy into the hands of anyone with caps and a willingness to trade in controlled substances. The Fiends did not create the chem supply. They simply organized around it. The supply would exist without them. What the Fiends provide is the demand, which in an economy with no meaningful law enforcement is sufficient basis for an entire territorial structure. A terminal inside one of the Fiends' occupied buildings contains a shopping list, not a supply request, a shopping list. Someone in the Fiends' camp wrote down items they wanted, organized by category, with estimated prices noted next to each entry. The list includes food, ammunition, and several types of chems ranked by preference with notations about which dealers could be trusted to provide quality product. It is the most mundane document in the possession of the most chaotic faction in the game. Whoever wrote it had organizational habits that belonged to a more structured life and continued applying them to a less structured one. The musical identity of Fallout New Vegas is inseparable from the period it represents, the post-war American optimism of the 1940s and 50s, filtered through a future that took that optimism at face value and then subjected it to 200 years of radiation and political instability. The songs on Radio New Vegas are not ironic. They were chosen because they are genuinely beautiful, genuinely moving, and genuinely expressive of a world that believed in itself in ways that the Mojave cannot. Ain't That a Kick in the Head by Dean Martin opens the game during its title sequence. The song was selected because it captures a particular kind of cheerful shock, the good kind of surprise, the love-struck stumble, the feeling of being knocked sideways by something wonderful. It plays over images of a world building toward nuclear annihilation. The juxtaposition was the point. The song that says, "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," plays over the beginning of the worst thing that ever happened to a civilization. And the gap between those two experiences is where Fallout lives. Blue Moon, which appears on Radio New Vegas in a version that drifts through the Mojave's evenings, like something that has been traveling a long way to reach the listener, is a song about waiting for something that has not yet arrived. It has been waiting for 200 years in the Mojave, and it plays on a radio station that will keep broadcasting until the power infrastructure finally fails. The song that is about waiting plays on a loop in a world that has been waiting for a long time for something worth having. It's All Over But the Crying plays in the Mojave at a slightly faster tempo than its original recording. The modification was made to better fit the game's audio system. The result is that a song about endings and irreversible losses plays in the wasteland with a faint urgency that its original version did not have, slightly quicker, slightly less resigned, as if the end of something might still, at this pace, be caught up with and reconsidered. The fastest version of a song about things being over plays in a world where everything ended and the people who survived kept going anyway. The bottle cap economy of the Mojave is, by any conventional economic analysis, completely irrational. Bottle caps are made of metal, but not a particularly valuable one. They can be produced using simple tools and readily available materials. Their supply is technically unlimited. Anyone with the equipment to stamp a cap and the material to stamp it from could produce them indefinitely. The wasteland uses them as currency anyway, because it needed something to use, because Nuka-Cola and Sunset Sarsaparilla were distributed widely enough before the war that their caps were genuinely abundant, and because once an economy starts treating something as money, stopping is harder than starting. Each bottle cap in Fallout New Vegas weighs a technically measurable amount. The game assigns a weight value of 0 to them, which is a gameplay concession rather than a physical claim. But the implication is that the wasteland's economy runs on an object so light it barely registers. The heaviest currency in the game is the old pre-war paper money, which weighs nothing and is worth almost nothing, and is used primarily for crafting. The relationship between weight and value in the Mojave's economy is the inverse of what it was in the old worlds. The Nuka-Cola caps that serve as the primary currency are technically produced in different factories across pre-war America, and careful examination of multiple caps in the game's higher resolution texture work reveals minor variations in the crimping around the edge, the depth of the embossed logo, and the precise shade of the paint used on the underside. These variations are the kind of thing that quality control would have smoothed out in high-volume factory production, but which appear because individual batches of caps were produced at slightly different calibrations. The currency of the wasteland is handmade in the sense that the machines that made it were not all the same machine. Cap-based transactions in the game are always instantaneous and always exact. The vendor's interface accepts any amount and returns change without hesitation or negotiation. This is a gameplay convenience that abstracts away the actual complexity of small unit transactions in a world where counting out 47 individual bottle caps across a market stall is a genuine logistical challenge. Real trades in the real Mojave presumably involve bags of caps, estimates, and the occasional disagreement about whether the bag weighs what the trader claims. The game collapses that complexity into a clean number exchange. The wasteland's economy is, in practice, more approximate than the UI suggests. The light at the end of the day in the Mojave has a quality that is hard to describe without simply describing what happens to light in real deserts at the same hour. It goes warm before it goes dark. The yellow of the afternoon shades toward orange, and then toward a deep copper that makes everything look like it has been lit from inside rather than from above. And for a few minutes, the ruins of the old world and the camps of the new one share the same golden light that the desert has always given at this hour, regardless of what is happening at the human scale. The game captures this transition in its lighting model as accurately as the technology available in 2010 permitted. It is not perfect. The shadows during the transition do not shift exactly as fast as they would in a real sky. The color temperature of the light does not quite match the experience of watching a desert sunset from ground level on a clear day in the American Southwest, but it is close enough that players who have stood in real deserts at evening and players who have only ever stood in digital ones encounter the transition with a similar recognition. The world doing what the world does at day's end, the light giving back what the darkness is about to take. At this hour, the campfires begin to matter more than they did during the day. The settlement lights that were invisible in daylight become visible against the deepening sky. The neon of the strip begins to mean something that it did not mean in sunlight. Not a distraction from the sun, but a replacement for it. The human insistence on light past the point where nature provides it. Running on stored power from a dam that everyone is fighting about, because whoever controls it controls the light. The companions, if present, settle into their evening routines. Boone watches the horizon. Arcade reads if there is a terminal nearby. Veronica finds something to keep her hands occupied. Cass finds something to drink. EDE drifts in a small patrol pattern, beeping softly, the sound frequency shifting slightly as the sky darkens above the Mojave, and the stars that never move come out in the photograph of the sky that serves as the ceiling of this world. None of this is required. The game does not ask the player to notice the sunset, or the companion's evening habits, or the way the campfires become more important as the light fails. It simply provides all of it, every evening cycle, in every part of the Mojave where those things are present. The world of Fallout New Vegas is, in these moments, operating at the level of texture rather than narrative, filling in the spaces between the things it needs to say with the things that simply make the world feel like a world. And the desert holds all of it with the same patience it has always had. The useless facts, the overlooked details, the small acts of care from people who worked against a deadline and chose to put things in anyway. The fires that respond to wind, the stars that never move, the game of pool that has been set up and never played. All of it present, all of it quiet, all of it waiting for someone with the patience to sit still long enough to let the desert speak in the language it actually uses, which is not the language of story or of drama, but the language of accumulation, the language of everything that remains when the urgency passes, and the only thing left is the particular beauty of things that simply are. Sleep gently. The Mojave keeps its watch tonight, as it has every other night. Patient, warm at the fire's edge, cold beyond the light's reach, and full, in all its smallest spaces, of the world that someone built with care. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.